Chapter 39 of The Marriage of Elinor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Marriage of Elinor by Margaret O. Oliphant. Chapter 39. Elinor had not been 3 days gone. Indeed, her mother had but just received a hurried note announcing her arrival in London, when, as she sat alone in the house, which had become so silent, Mrs. Denniston suddenly became aware of a rising of sound of the most jubilant, almost riotous description. It began by the barking of Yarrow, the old collie, who was fond of lying at the gate watching in a philosophic way of his own the mild traffic of the country road, the children trooping by to school, who hung about him in clusters, with lavish offerings of crust and scraps of biscuits, and all the leisurely country flaneurs whom the good dog despised, not thinking that he himself did nothing but flaner at his own door in the sun. A bark from Yarrow was no small thing in the stillness of the spring afternoon, and little Urisk, the terrier, which lay wrapped in dreams at Mrs. Denniston's feet, heard where he lay, entranced in the folds of sleep, and cocked up an eager ear, and uttered a subdued interrogation under his breath. The next thing was no bark, but a shriek of joy from Yarrow, such as could mean nothing in the world but Philip, or Pippo, which was what no doubt the dogs called him before following their mistress. Urisk heard and understood. He made but one spring from the footstool on which he lay and flung himself against the door. Mrs. Denniston sat for a moment and listened, much disturbed. When some troublous incident occurs in the deep quiet of domestic life, how often is it followed by another? And her heart turned a little sick. She was not comforted even by the fact that Urisk was waggling, not his tail only, but his whole little form in convulsions of joy, barking, crying aloud for the door to open, to let him forth. By this time all the friendly dogs about had taken up the sound out of sympathy with Yarrow's yells of delight, and into this came the clang of the gate, the sound of wheels, an outcry in a human voice, that of Barbara, the maid, and then a young shout that rang through the air. "Where's my mother, Barbara? Where's Granny?" Philip, it may be imagined, did not wait for any answer, but came in headlong, Yarrow leaping after him, Urisk springing into the air to meet him, himself in too great a hurry to heed either, flinging himself upon the astonished lady, who rose to meet him with a sudden kiss, and a "Where's my mother, Granny?" of eager greeting. "Pippo, good gracious, boy, what's brought you home now?" "Nothing but good news," he said. "So good I thought I must come. I've got it, Granny. Where is my mother?" "You've got it," she said, so full of other thoughts that she could not recollect what it was he meant. Pippo thought, as Elinor sometimes thought, that his Granny was getting slow of understanding, not so bright as she used to be in her mind. "Oh, Granny, you've been dozing. The scholarship. I've got it. I thought you would know the moment you heard me at the door." "My dear boy," she said, putting her arms about him, while the tall boy stood for the homage done to him, the kiss of congratulation. "You have got the scholarship, notwithstanding Howard and Musgrave and the hard fight there was to be." Pippo nodded, with a bright face of pleasure. "But," he said, "I can't say I'm sorry I've got it, Granny, but I wish there had been another for Musgrave, for he worked harder than I did, and he wanted so to win. But so did I, for that matter. And where is my mother all this time?" How delighted she will be, and what a comfort to her just now when she is upset and troubled. "My dear, it'll be a dreadful disappointment to you. Your mother is in London. She had to hurry off the day before yesterday, on business." "In London," cried Pippo. His countenance fell. He was so much disappointed that for a moment, big boy as he was, he looked ready to cry. He had come in bursting with his news, expecting a reception almost as tumultuous as that given him by the dogs outside. And he found only his grandmother, who forgot what it was he was in for, and no mother at all. It is a disappointment, Pippo, and it will be such a disappointment to her not to hear it from your own lips. But you must telegraph at once, and that will be next best. She has some worrying business, things that she hates to look after, and this will give her a little heart. What a bore, said Pippo, with his crest down and the light gone out of him. He gave himself up to the dogs who had been jumping about him, biding their time. Yarrow knew, he said, laughing, to get the water out of his eyes. He gave me a cheer whenever he saw me, dear old fellow. A little risky, too. And only Granny forgot, said Mrs. Denniston. That was very hard upon you, Pippo. My thoughts were all with your mother, and I couldn't think how you could get back at this time. Well, said the boy, my work's over, you know. There's nothing for a fellow to do after he's got the scholarship. I needn't go back at all, unless you and my mother wish it. I've, in a sort of way, done everything that I can do. Don't laugh at me, Granny. Laugh at you, boy? It is likely I should laugh at you. Don't you know I am as proud of you as your mother herself can be? I am glad and proud, said Mrs. Denniston, for I am glad for her as well as for you. Now, Pippo, you want something to eat. The boy looked up with a laugh. Yes, Granny, he said, you always divine that sort of thing. I do. Mrs. Denniston did not occupy her mind with any thought of that little unintentional and grateful jibe, that she always divined that sort of thing. Among the other great patiences of her life, she had learned to know that the mother and son, loving and tender as they were, had put her back unconsciously into the proper place of the old woman, always consulted, always thought of, never left out, but divining chiefly that sort of thing, the actual needs, the more apparent thoughts of those about her. She knew it, but she did not dwell upon it. Sometimes it made her smile, but it scarcely hurt her, and never made her bitter. She comprehended it all so well. Meanwhile, Pippo, left alone, devoted himself to the dogs for a minute or two, making them almost too happy. Then, at the very climax of riotous enjoyment, cast them off with a sudden, "Down, Yarrow!" which took all the curl in a moment out of the noble tail, with which Yarrow was sweeping all the unconsidered trifles off Mrs. Denniston's work-table. The young autocrat walked to the window as he shook off his adoring vassal, and stared out for a little with his hands deeply dug into his pockets. And then a new idea came into Pippo's head, the most brilliant new idea, which restored at once the light to his eyes and elevation to his crest. He said nothing of this, however, till he had done justice to the excellent luncheon, while his grandmother, seated beside him in the drawing-room with her knitting, looked on with pride and pleasure and saw him eat. This was a thing, they were all of accord, which he always thoroughly understood. You will run out now and telegraph your mother. She is in the old rooms in Ebury Street, Pippo. Yes, Granny, don't you think now a fellow of my age, having done pretty well and all that, might be trusted to make a little expedition out of his own head? My dear, you have always been trusted, Pippo. You know. I can't remember when your mother or I either have shown any want of trust. Oh, it's not that, said Pippo, confused. I know I've had lots, far more than most fellows, of my own way. It was not that exactly. I meant without consulting anyone, just to do a thing out of my own head. I have no doubt it will be quite a right thing, Pippo, but I should know better if you were to tell me. That would scarcely be doing it out of my own head, would it, Granny? But I can't keep a thing to myself. Now Musgrave can, you know. That's the great difference. I suppose it is having nobody but my mother and you, who always spoil me, that has made me that I can't keep a secret. It is something about making it up to Musgrave for not winning the scholarship. Philip grew red all over with a burning blush of shame. What a beast I am, he said. You will scarcely believe me, but I had forgotten that, though I do wish I could. I do wish there was any way. No, Granny, it was all about myself. Well, my dear, she said in her benignant, all-indulgent grandmother's voice. It is no use going beating about the bush, he said. Granny, I'm not going to telegraph to Mamma. I'll run up to London by the night mail. Pippo. Well, it isn't so extraordinary. Naturally, I should like to tell her better than to write. It didn't quite come off, my telling it to you, did it? But my mother will be excited about it, and then it will be a surprise seeing me at all. And then if she is worried by business, it will be a good thing to have me to stand by her. And, why, there are 100 reasons, Granny, as you must see, and then I should like it above all. My dear, said Mrs. Denniston, trembling a little. She had time during this long speech to collect herself, to get over the first shock, but her nerves still vibrated. In ordinary circumstances, I should think it an excellent plan, and you have worked well for it, and won your holiday, and your mother always enjoys wandering about town with you. Still, Pippo. Now what can there be against it, the boy said, with the same spark of fire coming into his blue eyes, which had often been seen in Elinor's hazel ones. He was like the Comptons, a refined image of his father, with the blue eyes and very dark hair, which had once made Phil Compton irresistible. Pippo had the habit, I am sorry to say, of being a little impatient with his grandmother. Her objections seemed so old-world and obsolete at the first glance. The chief thing against it is that I don't think your mother would wish it, Pippo. Mamma, think me a bore, perhaps, the lad cried, with a laugh of almost scornful amusement at this ridiculous idea. She would never, of course, think you a bore in any circumstances, but she will be very much confined. She could not take you with her to lawyers' offices. She will scarcely have any time to herself. What is this mysterious business, Granny? Indeed, Pippo, I can scarcely tell you. It is something connected with old times, that she wishes to have settled and done with. I did not inquire very closely, neither, I think, should you. You know your poor mother has had troubles in her life. Has she? Said Pippo, with wide-open eyes. I have never seen any. I think perhaps, don't you know, Granny, ladies make mountains of molehills, or so at least people say. Do they? Said Mrs. Denniston with a laugh. So you have begun to learn that sort of thing already, Pippo, even here at the end of the world. Pippo was a little mortified by her laugh, and a little ashamed of what he had said. It is very tempting at 18 to put on a man's superiority, yet he was conscious that it was perhaps a little ungenerous, he who owed all that he was and had to these two ladies. But naturally, he was the more angry because of this. I suppose, he said, that what is in every book that ever was written is likely to be true. But that has nothing to do with the question. I won't do anything against you if you forbid me absolutely, Granny. But short of that, I will go. Mrs. Denniston looked at the boy with all the heat in him of his first burst of independence. It is only wise to compute the forces opposed to one before one launches a command which one may not have force to ensure obedience to. He said that he would not disobey her absolutely with his lips, but his eyes expressed a less dutiful sentiment. She had no mind to be beaten in such a struggle. Elinor had complained of her mother in her youth that she was too reasonable, too unwilling to command, too reluctant to assume the responsibility of an act. And it was not to be supposed that she had mended of this, in all the experience she had had of her impatient daughter, and under the influence of so many additional years. She looked at Philip and concluded that he would at least find some way of eluding her authority if she exercised it, and it did not consist with her dignity to be either absolutely or partially disobeyed. "You forget," she said, "that I have never taken such authority upon me since you were a child. I will not forbid you to do what you have set your heart upon. I can only say, Philip, that I don't think your mother would wish you to go." "If that's all, Granny," said the boy, "I think I can take my mother into my own hands. But why do you call me Philip? You never call me that, but when you are angry." "Was I ever angry?" she said with a smile. "But if we are to consider you a man looking down upon women and taking your movements upon your own responsibility, my dear, it would be ridiculous that you should be little Pippo any more." "Not little Pippo," he said, with a boyish, complacent laugh, rising up to his full height. A young man nearly 6 feet high, with a scholarship in his pocket. How was he to be expected to take the law from his old grandmother as to what he is to do? And young Philip did go to town triumphantly by the night mail. He had never done such a thing before, and his sense of manly independence, of daring, almost of adventure, was more delightful than words could say. There was not even anyone, except the man who had driven him into Penrith, to see him away. He who was generally accompanied to the last minute by precautions and admonitions and farewells. To feel himself dart away into the night with nobody to look back to, on the platform, no gaze, half smiling, half tearful, to follow him, was of itself an emancipation to Pippo. He was a good boy and no rebel against the double maternal bond which had lain so lightly, yet so closely upon him all his life. It was only for a year or two that he had suspected that this was unusual, or even imagined that for a growing man, the sway of two ladies, and even their devotion, might make others smile. Perhaps he had been a little more particular in his notions, in his manners, in his fastidious dislike to dirt and careless habits, than was common in the somewhat rough North Country school, which had so risen in scholastic note under the last headmaster, but which was very far from the refinements of Eton. And lately it had begun to dawn upon him that a mother and a grandmother to watch over him and care for him in everything might be perhaps a little absurd for a young man of his advanced age. Thus his escapade, which was against the will of his elder guardian, and without the knowledge of his mother, which was entirely his own act, and on his own responsibility, went to Philip's head, and gave him a sort of intoxication of pleasure. That his mother should be displeased, really displeased, should not want him, incredible thought, never entered into his mind save as an accountable delusion of Granny's. His mother not want him? All the arguments in the world would never have got that into young Pippo's head. Mrs. Denniston, waking up in the middle of the night to think of the boy, rushing on through the dark on his adventurous way, recollected only then, with much confusion and pain, that she ought to have telegraphed to Elinor, who might be so engaged as to make it very embarrassing for her, in her strange circumstances, to see Pippo, that the boy was coming. In her agitation she had forgotten this precaution. Was it perhaps true, as the young ones thought, that she was getting a little slower in her movements, a little dulled in her thoughts? End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of The Marriage of Elinor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Marriage of Elinor by Margaret O. Oliphant, Chapter 40. John Tatum had in vain attempted to persuade Elinor to come to his house, to dine there in comfort. He was going out himself, so that at least in this time of excitement and trouble, she might have the careful service and admirable comfort of his well-managed house. Elinor preferred her favorite lodgings and a cup of tea to all the luxuries of Halkin Street, and she was fit for no more consultations that night. She had many things to think of, and some new which as yet she barely comprehended. The rooms in Ebury Street were small, and they were more or less dingy, as such rooms are, but they were comfortable enough, and had as much of home to Elinor as repeated visits there with all her belongings could give them. The room in which she slept was next to that in which her boy had usually slept. That was enough to make it no strange place, and I need not say that it became the scene of many discussions during the few days that followed. The papers by this time were full of the strange trial which was coming on, the romance of commercial life and ruin, the guilty man who had been absent so long, enjoying his ill-gotten gains, and who now was dragged back into the light to give an account of himself, and of other guilt perhaps less black than his own, yet dreadful enough to hear of. The story of the destroyed books was a most remarkable and picturesque incident in the narrative. The leading papers looked up their own account of the facts given at the time, and pointed out how evidently justified by the new facts made known to the public was the theory they had themselves given forth. As these theories, however, were very different, and as all claimed to be right, perhaps the conclusion was less certain than this announcement gave warrant to believe. But each and all promised revelations of the most surprising kind, involving some of the highest aristocracy, the Democratic papers said, bringing to light an exciting story of the private relations between husband and wife, said those of society, and revealing a piquant chapter of social history hushed up at the time. It was a modest print indeed, that contented itself with the statement that its readers would find a romance of real life involved in the trial which was about to take place. Elinor did not, fortunately, see all these comments. The Times and the Morning Post were dignified and reticent, and she did not read, and was indeed scarcely cognizant of the existence of most of the others. But the faintest reference to the trial was enough, and it need hardly be said to make the blood boil in her veins. It was a curious thing in her state of mind, and with the feeling she had toward her husband's family, that one of the first things she did on establishing herself at Ebury Street rooms was to look for an old peerage, which had lain for several years, she remembered, on a certain shelf. Genteel lodgings in Ebury Street, which did not possess somewhere an old peerage, would be out of the world indeed. She found it in the same corner as of old, where she had noted it so often and avoided it as if it had been a serpent. But now the first thing she did, as soon as her tray was brought her, and all necessary explanations given, and the door shut, was to take the book furtively from its place, almost as if she were afraid of what she should see. What a list there was of sons of Lord St. Cerf, some she had never known, who died young, and Reginald in India, and Hal, who was so kind. What a good laugh he had, she remembered. Not a joyless cackle like Mary Ann's, a good natural laugh, and a kind light in his eyes. And he had been kind. She could remember ever so many things, nothings, things that made a little difference in the dull, cloudy sky of a neglected wife. Poor Hal, and he too was gone, and Saint Surf dying, and Pippo the heir. Pippo was perhaps, for anything she knew, Lord Lomond now. To say this did not startle Elinor, did not make her heart beat, did not open new complications and vistas in life, would be a thing impossible. Pippo, Lord Lomond. Pippo, whom she had feared to expose to her father's influence, whom she had kept apart, who did not know anything about himself, except that he was her son. Had she kept and guarded the boy thus in the very obscurity of life, in the stillest and most protected circumstances, only to plunge him suddenly at last, without preparation, without warning, into the fiery furnace of temptation, into a region where he might pardonably, perhaps, put himself beyond her influence, beyond her guidance? Poor Elinor! And yet she was not wholly to be pitied either, for her heart was fired by the thought of her boy's elevation in spite of herself. It did not occur to her that such an elevation for him meant something also for her. That view of the case she did not take into consideration for a moment. Nay, she did not think of it. But that Pippo should be Lord Lomond went through her like an arrow that gave a wound, acute and sharp, yet no pain, if such a thing could be said. That he should discover his father had been the danger before her all his life. But if he must find out that he had a father, that was a way in which it might not be all pain. I do not pretend that she was very clear in all these thoughts. Indeed, she was not clear at all. John Tatum, knowing but one side, had begun to think vaguely of Elinor, what Elinor thought of her mother, that her mind was not quite as of old, not so bright nor so vivid, not so clear in coming to a conclusion. Had he known everything, he might not have been so sure even on that point. But then had he known everything that Elinor knew, and been aware of what it was which Elinor had been summoned by, all the force of old fidelity and the honor of her name to do, John would have been too much horrified to have been able to form an opinion. No, poor Elinor was not at all clear in her thoughts, less clear than ever after these revelations. The way before her seemed dark in whatever way she looked at it. Complications were round her on every side. She had instinctively, without a word said, given up that idea of flight. Who was it that said the heir to a peerage could not be hid? John had said it, she remembered, and John was always right. If she was to take him away to the uttermost end of the earth, they would seek him out and find him. And then there was his father, who had known all the time, and had known and never disturbed her. No wonder that poor Elinor's thoughts were mixed and complicated. She walked up and down the room, not thinking, but letting crowds and flights of thought like birds fly through her mind. No longer clear indeed as she had been wont to be. No longer coming to sudden, sharp conclusions, admitting possibilities of which Elinor once upon a time would never have thought. And day by day, as he saw her, John Tatum understood her less and less. He did not know what she meant, what she was going to do. What were her sentiments towards her husband? What were her intentions towards her son? He had found out a great deal about the case, merely as a case, and it began to be clear to him where Elinor's part came in. Elinor Compton could not have appeared on her husband's behalf, and whether there might not arise a question whether, being now his wife, her evidence could be taken on what had happened before she was his wife, was by no means sure. "Why didn't they call your mother?" John said, as Mrs. Denniston also had said. But he did not at all understand. How could he? The dismay that came over Elinor, and the "not for the world," which came from her lips. He had come in to see her in the morning as he went down to his chambers, on the very morning when Pippo, quite unexpected and also not at all desired, was arriving at Euston Square. It would have been much better, he said, in every way if they had called your mother, who of course must know exactly what you know, Elinor, in respect to this matter. No, said Elinor with dry lips, she knows nothing. She calculates back by little incidents. She does not remember. I do. That's natural, I suppose, said John, with an impatient sigh and a half-angry look. Still, my aunt would do no good at all, you may believe me, John. Don't let us speak of this any more. I know what has to be done. My mother would twist herself up among her calculations about Alec Hudson's examination, and I know not what. Whereas there is nothing more to be said. I thought I could escape, and it is your doing if I now see that I cannot escape. I can but hope that Providence will protect my boy. He is at school, where they have little time for reading the papers. He may never even see, or at least if he does, he may think it is another Compton, someone whom he never heard of. And how if he becomes Lord Lomond, as I said, before the secret is out? Oh, John, cried Elinor, wringing her hands. Don't torment me with that idea now. Let only this be past, and then... Oh, I see. I am not a fool. I perceive that I cannot hide him, as you say, if that happens. But, oh, John, for pity's sake, let this be over first. Let us not hurry everything on at the same time. He is at school. What do schoolboys care for the newspapers, especially for trials in the law courts? Oh, let this be over first. A boy at school, and he need never know. It was at this moment that a hansom drew up, and a rattling peal came at the door. Hansoms are not rare in Ebury Street, and how can one tell in these small houses if the peal is at one's door or the next? Elinor was not disturbed. She paid no attention. She expected no one. She was afraid of nothing new for the present. Surely, as she said, there was enough for the present. It did not seem possible that any new incident should come now. I do not want to torment you, Elinor. You may imagine I would be the last. I would only save you if I could from what must be. What? Who's this? Philip, the boy. The door burst open with an eager, impatient hand upon it, and there stood upon the threshold, in all the mingled excitement and fatigue of his night journey, pale, sleep in his eyes, yet happy expectation, exultation, the certainty of open arms to receive him, and cries of delight. The boy. He stood for a second looking into the strange yet familiar room. John Tatum had sprung to his feet and stood startled, hesitating, while young Philip's eyes, noting him with a glance, flashed past him to the other more important, more beloved, the mother whom he had expected to rush towards him with an outcry of joy. And Elinor sat still in her chair, struck dumb, grown pale like a ghost, her eyes wide open, her lips apart. The sight of the boy, her beloved child, her pride and delight, was as horrible a spectacle to Elinor. She stared at him like one horrified, and neither moved nor spoke. Elinor, cried John, terrified, there's nothing wrong. Don't you see it's Philip? Boy, what do you mean by giving her such a fright? She's fainting, I believe. I? Give her a fright, cried, half in anguish, half in indignation, the astonished boy. No, I'm not fainting, Pippo. There's nothing wrong. At home, Elinor cried, holding out her hand to him, coming to herself, which meant only awakening to the horror of a danger far more present than she had ever dreamt, and to the sudden sight not of her boy, but of that nemesis which she had so carefully prepared for herself, and which had been awaiting her for years. She was not afraid of anything wrong at home. It was the first shield she could find in the shock which had almost paralyzed her, to conceal her terror and distress at the sight of him from the astonished, disappointed, mortified, and angry boy. "I thought," he said, "you would have been glad to see me, Mother. No, there's nothing wrong at home." "Thank heaven for that," cried Elinor, feeling herself more and more a hypocrite as she recovered from the shock. "Pippo, I was saying this moment that you were at school. The words were scarcely off my lips, and then to see you in a moment, standing there." "I thought," he repeated again, trembling with the disappointment and mortification, wounded in his cheerful, confident affection and in his young pride, the monarch of all he surveyed. "I thought you would have been pleased to see me, Mother." "Of course," said John cheerfully. "Your mother is glad to see you, and so am I, you impetuous boy, though you don't take the trouble of shaking hands with me. He wants to be kissed and coddled, Elinor, and I must be off to my chambers. But I should like to know first, what's up, boy? You've got something to say." "Pippo, what is it, my dearest? You did give me a great fright, and I am still nervous a little. Tell me, Pippo, something has brought you. Your Uncle John is right. I can see it in your eyes. You've got something to tell me." The tired and excited boy looked from one to another, two faces both full of a veiled but intense anxiety, looking at him as if what they expected was no good news. He burst out into a big, hoarse laugh, the only way to keep himself from crying. "You don't even seem to remember anything about it," he cried, flinging himself down in the nearest chair. "And for my part, I don't care any longer whether anyone knows or not." And Elinor, whose thoughts were on such different things, whose whole mind was absorbed in the question of what he could have heard about the trial, about his father, about the new and strange future before him, gazed at him with eyes that seemed hollowed out, all round with devouring anxiety. "What is it?" she said. "What is it? For God's sake, tell me. What have you heard?" It goes against all prejudices to imagine that John Tatum, a man who never had had a child, an old bachelor not too tolerant of youth, should have divined the boy better than his mother. But he did, perhaps because he was a lawyer and accustomed to investigate the human countenance and eye. He saw that Philip was full of something of his own, immediately interesting to himself, and he cast about quickly in his mind what it could be. Not that the boy was heir to a peerage. He would never have come like this to announce that. But something that Philip was cruelly disappointed his mother did not remember. This passed through John's mind like a flash, though it takes a long time to describe. "Ah," he said, "I begin to divine. Was not there something about a scholarship?" "Pippo," cried Elinor, lighting up great lamps of relief, of sudden ease and quick-coming joy in her brightened eye and face. "My boy, you've won your battle. You've got it. You've got it, Pippo. And your foolish, stupid mother that thought for a moment you could rush to her like this with anything but good news." It took a few moments to soothe Pippo down and mend his wounded feelings. "I began to think nobody cared," he said, "and that made me that I didn't care myself. I'd rather Musgrave had got it, if it had not been to please you all. And you never seemed so much as to remember. Only Uncle John," he added after a moment, with a half-scorn which made John laugh at the never-failing candor of youth. "Only the least important of all," he said. "It was atrocious of the ladies, Philip. Shake hands, my boy. I owe you £5 for the scholarship, and now I'll take myself off, which will please you most of all." He went downstairs laughing to himself all the way, but got suddenly quite grave as he stepped outside, whether because he remembered that it does not become a Q.C. and M.P. to laugh in the street, or for other causes it does not become us to attempt to say. And Elinor, meanwhile, made it up to her boy amply. and while her heart ached with the question what to do with him, how to dispose of him during those dreadful following days, behaved herself as if her head, too, was half turned with joy and exultation, only tempered by the regret that Musgrave, who had worked so hard, could not have got the scholarship too. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of The Marriage of Elinor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Marriage of Elinor by Margaret O. Oliphant, Chapter 41. Elinor made much of her boy during that day and the following days to take away the sense of disappointment which, even after the first great mortification, was got over still haunted young Philip's mind. It surprised him beyond measure to find that she did not wish to go out with him. Indeed, insofar as was possible, avoided it altogether, save for a hurried drive to a few places, during which she kept her veil down and sheltered herself with an umbrella in the most ridiculous way. "Are you afraid of your complexion, Mother?" the boy asked of her with disdain. "It looks like it," she said, but with a laugh that was full of embarrassment, "though it is a little late in the day." Elinor was perhaps better aware than Pippa was that she had a complexion which a girl might have envied, and was still as fresh as a rose, notwithstanding that she was a year or two over 40. But I need not say that it was not of her complexion she was thinking. She had been careful to choose her time on previous visits to London so as to risk as little as possible the chance of meeting her husband. But now there was no doubt that he was in town, and not the least that if he met her anywhere with Pippo, her secret, so far as it had ever been a secret, would be in his hands. Even when John took the boy out, it was with a beating heart that his mother saw him go, for John was too well known to make any secret possible about his movements, or who it was who was with him. Perhaps it was for this reason that John desired to take him out, and even cut short his day's work on one or two occasions to act as cicerone to Philip. He took him to the house, to the great excitement and delight of the boy, who only wished that the entertainment could have been made complete by a speech from Uncle John, which was a point in which his guide, philosopher, and friend, though in every other way so complacent, did not humor Pippo. On one occasion during the first week, they had an encounter which made John's middle-aged pulses move a little quicker. When they were walking along through Hyde Park, having strolled that way in the fading of the May afternoon, when the carriages were still promenading up and down, before they returned to Halkin Street to dinner, where Elinor awaited them, it happened to Mr. Tatum to meet the roving eye of Lady Mary Ann, who lay back languidly in her carriage, wrapped in a fur cloak and shivering in the chill of the evening. She was not particularly interested in anything or any person whom she had seen, and was a little cross and desirous of getting home. But when she saw John, she roused up immediately and gave a sign to Dolly, who sat by her, to pull the check string. "Mr. Tatum," she cried in her shrill voice. Lady Mary Ann was not one of the people who object to hear their voice in public or are reluctant to make their wishes known to everybody. She felt herself to be of the caste in which everybody is interested, and that the public liked to know whom she honored with her acquaintance. "Mr. Tatum, are you going to carry your rudeness so far as not to seem to know me? Oh, come here this moment, you impertinent man." "Can I be of any use to you, Lady Mary Ann?" said John gravely, at the carriage door. "Oh, dear, no. You can't be of any use. What should I have those men for, if I wanted you to be of use? Come and talk a moment, that's all. Or get into the carriage, and I'll take you anywhere." Dolly and I have driven round and round, and we have not seen a creature we cared to see. Yes, there was a darling little Maltese terrier, with white silk curls hanging over his eyes, on an odious woman's lap. But I cannot expect you to find that angel for me. Mr. Tatum, who is that tall boy? Pippo, said John quickly, though probably he never in his life before used that name, which he disapproved of angrily, as people often do of a childish name which does not please them. Go on. I'll come after you directly. The boy is a cousin of mine, Lady Marianne, just from school. Mr. Tatum, I am quite sure it is Nell's boy. Call after him. What's his name? Bring him back. John Thomas. Run after the young gentleman and say with my compliments. Nothing, said John, stopping the footman with a lifted hand and a still more emphatic look. He is hastening home to an engagement, and it's evident I had better go too, for your little friend there is showing his teeth. The darling, said Lady Marianne. Did it show its little pearls at the wicked man that will not do what its mummy says? Dolly, can't you jump down and run after that boy? I am sure it is your Uncle Philip's boy. He is out of sight, Mother, said Miss Dolly calmly. You are the most dreadful, wicked, unkind people, all of you. Show its little teeth then, darling. Who's the only one that has any feelings? Mr. Tatum, do tell me something about this trial. What is going to be done? Phil is mixed up in it. I know he is. Can they do anything to anybody after all this time? They can't make you pay up, I know, after a certain time. Oh, couldn't it all be hushed up and stopped and kept out of the newspapers? I hate the newspapers, always chuckling over every new discovery. But this cannot be called a new discovery. If it's true, it's old as the old beginning of the world. Don't you think somebody could get at the newspaper men and have it hushed up? I doubt if you could get hold of all of them. Their name is Legion, said John. Oh, I don't care what their name is. If you will help me, Mr. Tatum, we could get hold of most of them, won't you? You know, don't you? Poor St. Cerf is so bad. It may be over any day. And then only think what a complication. Dolly, turn your head the other way. Look at that silly young Huntsfield capering about to catch your eye. I don't want you to hear what I have got to say. I don't in the least way want to hear what you have got to say, dear mamma, said Dolly. That would have made me listen to every word, said Lady Marianne. But girls are more queer nowadays than anything that ever was. Mr. Tatum, she put her hand upon his, which was on the carriage door, and bent her perfumed, powdered face towards him. For goodness sake, think how awkward it would be. A man just succeeding to a title and that sort of thing, put on all the papers about him. Do stop it, or try something to stop it for goodness sake. I assure you, said John, I can do nothing to stop it. I am as powerless as you are. Oh, I don't say that I am powerless, said Lady Marianne, with her shrill laugh. One has one's little ways of influence. Then she put her hand again upon John with a sudden grip. Mr. Tatum, she said, tell me in confidence, was that Phil's boy? I have told you, Lady Marianne, it is a nephew of mine. A nephew? Oh, I know what kind of a nephew. Allemand de Bretagne. She turned her head to the other side, where her daughter was gazing calmly in front of her. Dolly, I was sure of it, she cried. Don't you hear? Dolly, don't you hear? Which, mamma, said Dolly gravely. Of course I could not help hearing it all. Which part was I to notice? About the newspapers or about the boy? Lady Marianne appealed to earth and heaven with the loud cackle of her laugh. He can't deny it, she said. He as good as owns it. I am certain that's the boy that will be Lomond. Uncle St. Cerf is not dead yet, said Dolly reprovingly. Poor Cerf, but he's so very bad, said Lady Marianne, that it's almost the same thing. Mr. Tatum, can't we take you anywhere? I'm so glad I've seen Nell's boy. Can't we drive you home? Perhaps you've got Nell there, too. John stood back from the carriage door, just in time to escape the start of the horses as the remorseless string was touched and the footman clambered up into his seat. Lady Marianne's smile went off her face, and she had forgotten all about it, to judge from appearances, before he had got himself in motion again. And a little farther on, behind the next tree, he found young Philip waiting, full of curiosity and questions. Who was that lady, Uncle John? Was she asking about me? I thought I heard her call. I had half a mind to run back and say, here I am. It was much better that you didn't do anything of the kind. Never pay any attention when you think you hear a fine lady calling you, Philip. It is better not to hear the siren's call. When the elderly siren's like that, said the boy with a laugh. But I say, Uncle John, if you won't tell me who the lady is, who is the girl? She has a pair of eyes, not like sirens, though. Eyes that go through you, like a pair of lancets. A surgical operation, in fact. And I shouldn't wonder if she meant to be a doctor, said John. The mother has done nothing all her life. Therefore the daughter means to do much. It is the natural reaction of the generations. But I never noticed that Miss Dolly had any eyes to speak of, said the highly indifferent middle-aged man. The boy flushed with the sense of indignation. Perhaps you think the old ladies were finer, he said. I never admired the old lady, as you call her, said John shortly, and then he turned Philip's attention to something, possibly with the easily satisfied conviction of a spectator that the boy thought of it no more. We met my Lady Marianne in the park, he said to Elinor, when they sat at dinner an hour later at the bachelor table in Halkin Street, where everything was so exquisitely cared for. It was like Elinor, but most unlike the place in which she found herself, that she started so violently as to shake the whole table, crying out in a tone of consternation, "John!" as if he did not know very well what he might venture to say, or as if he had any intention of betraying her to her son. She was very anxious, he said, perhaps playing a little with her excitement, to have Philip presented to her, but I sent him on, that is to say, I thought I sent him on. The fellow went no farther than to the next tree, where he stood and watched Miss Dolly, not feeling any interest in the old lady, as he said. Well, Uncle John, did you expect me to look at the old lady? You are not so fond of old ladies yourself. And who is Miss Dolly? Said Elinor, trying to conceal the beating of her heart and the quiver on her lip with a smile. And then she added, with a little catch of her breath, oh yes, I remember there was a little girl. You will be surprised to hear that we are by way of being great friends. Her ladyship visits me in my chambers. Again Elinor uttered that startled cry, John! But she tried this time to cover it with a tremulous laugh. Are you becoming a flirt in your old age? It appears so, said John, and then he added, that aphorism, which struck you as it struck me, Elinor, by its good sense, about the heir to a peerage, is really her production, and not mine. Miss Dolly's? And what was the aphorism, Uncle John? Cried Philip. No, it was not Miss Dolly's, my young man. It was the mother's, and so, of course, does not interest you any more. It did not, as a matter of fact. The old lady was supremely indifferent to Pippo. But as they looked up, saying something else, which did not bear upon the subject, it occurred to the boy, as it will sometimes occur by the merest chance to a young observer, to notice his mother. She caught his eye somehow in the most accidental way, and Pippa was too well acquainted with her looks not to perceive that there was a thrill in every line of her countenance, a slight nervous tremble in her hands and entire person, such as was in no way to be accounted for, he thought, by anything that had been said or done. There was nothing surely to disquiet her in dining at Uncle John's, the three alone, not even one other guest to fill up the vacant side of the table. Philip had himself thought that Uncle John might have asked someone to meet them. He should have remembered that he himself, Philip, was now of an age to dine out and see a little society and go into the world. But what in the name of all that was wonderful was there in this entertainment to agitate his mother? And John Tatum had a look which Philip did not understand, the look of a man who was successful in argument, who was almost crushing an opponent. It was as if a duel had been going on between them, and the man was the victor, which, as was natural, immediately threw Philip violently on the other side. "You're not well, mother," he said. "Do you think not, Pippo? Well, perhaps you are right. London is too much for me. I am a country bird," said Elinor with smiling yet trembling lips. "You shall not go to the theater if you are not up to it," said the boy in his imperious way. She gave him an affectionate look, and then she looked across the table at John. What did that look mean? There was a faint smile in it, and there was a great deal which Philip did not understand, things understood by Uncle John, who was, after all, what you might call an outsider, no more, and not by him, her son. Could anything be so monstrous? Philip blazed up with sudden fire. "No," said John Tatum, "I think Philip's right. We'll take her home to be coddled by her maid, and we'll go off, two wild young fellows, to the play by ourselves." "No," said Philip, "I'll leave her to be coddled by no maid. I can take care of my mother myself." "My dear boy," said Elinor, "I want no coddling, but I doubt whether I could stand the play. I'd like you to go with Uncle John." And then it began to dawn upon Philip that his mother had never meant to be of the party, and that this was what had been settled all along. He was more angry, more wounded and hurt in his spirit than he had, of course, the least occasion to be. He was of opinion that his mother had never had any secrets from him, that she had taken him into her confidence since he was a small boy, even things that Granny did not know. And here all at once there was rising between them a cloud, a mist, which there was no reason for. If he had done anything to make him less worthy, he would have understood. Had there been a bad report from school, had he failed in his work and disappointed her, there might have been some reason for it. But he had done nothing of the kind. Never before had he been so deserving of confidence. He had got his scholarship. He had finished the first phase of his education in triumph, and fulfilled all her expectations. And now, just at this point of all others, just when he was most fit to understand, most worthy of trust, she turned from him. His heart swelled as if it would burst, with anger first, almost too strong to be repressed, and with that sense of injured merit which is of all things the most hard to bear. It is hard enough even when one is aware one deserves no better. But to be conscious of your worth and to feel that you are not appreciated, that is indeed too much for anyone. There was not even the satisfaction of giving up the play which he had looked forward to, making a sacrifice of it to his mother, in which there would have been a severe pleasure. But she did not want him. She preferred that he should leave her by herself to be coddled by her maid, as Uncle John vulgarly said. Or perhaps was there somebody else coming, some old friend whom he knew nothing of? Somebody, someone or other, like that old witch in the carriage, whom Pippa was not meant to know. It ended, however, in the carrying out of the plan settled beforehand by those old conspirators. The old conspirators do generally manage to carry out their plans for the management of rebellious youth, however injured the latter may feel. Pippa wound himself up in solemn dignity and silence when he understood that it was ordained that he should proceed to the play with John Tatum, and the pair had got halfway to Drury Lane, or it may have been the Lyceum, or the Haymarket, or any of half a dozen other theaters, for here exact information fails, before he condescended to open his lips for more than yes or no. But Philip's gloom did not survive the raising of the curtain, and he had forgotten all offenses, and had taken his companion into favor again, and was talking to Uncle John between the acts with all the excitement of a country youth to whom a play still was the greatest of novelties and delights, when he suddenly saw a change come over John Tatum's countenance and a slight bow of recognition directed towards a box, which made Philip turn round and look too. And there was the old witch of the carriage, and, what was more interesting, the girl with the keen eyes, who looked out suddenly from the shade of the draperies, and fixed upon Philip himself, a look which startled the young hero much. Nor was this all, for later in the evening, after another act of the play, someone else appeared in the same box, and fixed the dark and impassive stare of a long pair of opera glasses upon Philip. It amused him at first, and afterward it half frightened him, and finally made him very angry. The gazer was a man, of whom, however, Philip could make nothing out but his white shirt front and his tall stature, and the long black tubes of the opera glass. Was it at him the man was looking, or perhaps at Uncle John? But the boy thought it, on the whole, unlikely that anybody should stare in that way at anything so little out of the ordinary as Uncle John. "I say," he said in the next interval, "who is that fellow staring at us out of your old lady's box?" "Staring at the ladies behind us, you mean," said John. "Pippo, do you think we could make a rush for it the moment the play's over? I've got something to look over when I get home. Are you game to be out the very first before the curtain's down?" "Certainly I'm game," said Philip, delighted. "If you wish it, Uncle John." "Yes, I wish it," said the other, and he put his hand on the boy's shoulder as the act finished and the characters of the piece drew together for the final tableau, and the pair managed it triumphantly, and were the very first to get out at the head of the crowd, to Philip's immense amusement and John Tatum's great relief. The elder hurried the younger into the first hansom, all in the twinkling of an eye, and then for the first time his gravity relaxed. Philip took it all for a great joke till they reached Ebury Street. But when his companion left him, and he had time to think of it, he began to ask himself why. End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of The Marriage of Elinor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Marriage of Elinor by Margaret Oliphant, Chapter 42. I will not say that Philip's sleep was broken by this question, but it undoubtedly recurred to his mind the first thing in the morning when he jumped out of bed very late for breakfast, and the events of the past night and the lateness of the hour at which he got to rest came back upon him as excuses in the first place for his tardiness. And then, which was remarkable, it was not the scene in the play in which he had been most interested which came to his mind, but a vision of that box and the man standing in front of it, staring at him through the black tubes of the opera glass, which came before Philip like a picture. Uncle John had said it was at the ladies behind, But the boy felt sure it was no lady behind, but himself, on whom that stare was fixed. Who would care to stare so at him? It faintly gleamed across his thoughts that it might be someone who had heard of the scholarship, but he dismissed that thought instantly with a blush. It also gleamed upon him with equal vagueness, like a momentary but entirely futile light, consciously derived from storybooks, and of which he was much ashamed that the inexplicable attention given to himself might have something to do with the girl who had such keen eyes. Philip blushed fiery red at this involuntary thought, and chased it from his mind like a mad dog. But he could not put away the picture of the box, the girl putting aside the curtain to look at him, and the opera glass fixed upon his face. And then why was Uncle John in such a hurry to get away? It had seemed a capital joke at that moment. But when he came to think of it, it was rather strange that a man who might be Solicitor General tomorrow, if he liked, and probably Lord Chancellor in a few years, should make a schoolboy rush from the stalls of a theater with the object of being first out. Philip disapproved of so undignified a step on the part of his elderly relation, and he saw now, in the serious morning, that Uncle John was very unlikely to have done it for fun. What, then, did it mean? He came down full of these thoughts, and rather ashamed of being late, wondering whether his mother would have waited for him, which would have annoyed him, or if she would have finished her breakfast, which would have annoyed him still more. Happily for Elinor, she had hit the golden mean, and was pouring out for herself a second cup of coffee. But Philip was not aware it was the second, when the boy appeared. She was quite restored to her usual serenity and freshness, and as eager to know how he had enjoyed himself as she always was. He gave her a brief sketch of the play and of what pleased him in it, as in duty bound. But, he added, what interested me almost more was that we had a sort of a little play of our own. What? She cried, with a startled look in her eyes. One thing that puzzled him was that she was so very easily startled, which it seemed to Philip had never been the case before. Well, he said, the lady was there whom Uncle John met in the park, and the girl with her, and I believe the little dog. She made all sorts of signs to him, but he took scarcely any notice. But that's not all, Mother. It's a good deal, Pippo. Is it? Why do you speak in that choked voice, Mother? I suppose it is just one of his society acquaintances. But the thing was that before the last act somebody else came forward to the front of the box and fixed, I was going to say his eyes, I mean his opera glasses upon us. Philip had meant to say upon me, but he had produced already so great an effect on his mother's face that he moderated instinctively the point of this description, and stared at us, he added, all the rest of the time, paying not the least attention to anything that was going on. It's a queer sensation, he went on with a laugh, to feel that black, mysterious-looking thing, like the eyes of some monster, with no speculation in them, fixed upon you. Now I want you to tell me. What's the matter, Mother? Nothing, Pippo, nothing, said Elinor faintly, stooping to lift up a book she had let fall. Go on with your story. I am very much interested. And then, my dear? Mother, cried Philip, I don't know what has come over you or over me. There's something going on I can't understand. You never used to have any secrets from me. I was always in your confidence, wasn't I, Mother? It was not a book she had let fall, but a ring that she had dropped from her finger, and which had to be followed over the carpet. It made her red and flushed when she half raised her head to say, Yes, Pippo, you know, I have always told you. Philip did not remark that what his mother said was nothing after all. He got up to help her look for her ring, and put his arm round her waist as she knelt on the floor. "Yes, Mamma," he said tenderly, protectingly. "I do know, but something's changed. Either it's in me that makes you feel you can't trust me, or else it is in you, and I don't know which would be worst." "There is no change," she said after a moment, for she could not help the ring being found. And immediately, when his quick, young eyes came to the search, but she did not look him in the face. "There is no change, dear. There is only some worrying business which involves a great many troubles of my old life before you were born. You shall hear everything in a little while, but I cannot enter into it all at this moment. It is full of complications and secrets that belong to other people. Pippo, you must promise me to wait patiently and to believe always the best you can, of your mother." The boy laughed as he raised her up, still holding her with his arm. "Believe the best I can? Well, I don't think that would be a great effort, Mother. Only to think that you can't trust me, as you always have done, makes me wretched. We've been such friends, haven't we, Mamma? I've always told you everything, or at least everything, except just the nonsense at school. And you've told me everything. And if we are going to be different now?" "You've told me everything." The boy was as sure of it as that he was born. She had to hold by him to support herself, and it cost her a strong effort to restrain the shiver that ran through her. "We are not going to be different," she said, "as soon as we leave London, or before. You shall know everything about this business of mine, Pippo. Will that satisfy you? In the meantime, it is not a pleasant business, dear, and you must bear with me if I am abstracted sometimes, and occupied, and cross." "But, Mother," said Philip, bending over her with that young, celestial, foolish look of gravity and good advice, with which a neophyte will sometimes address the much experienced and heavily laden pilgrim, "don't you think it would be easier if it was all open between us, and I took my share? If it is other people's secrets, I would not betray them. You know that." Unfortunately, Elinor here murmured, scarcely knowing what words came from her lips, "That is what John says." "John," said the boy, furious with the quick rage of injured tenderness and pride. "Uncle John, and you tell him more, him, an outsider, than you tell me?" He let her go then, which was a great relief to Elinor, for she could command herself better when he was a little farther off, and could not feel the thrill that was in her, and the thumping of her heart. "You must remember, Pippo," she said, "what I have told you, that my present very disagreeable, very painful business is about things that happened before you were born, which John knew everything about. He was my adviser then, as far as I would take any advice, which I am afraid never was much, Pippo," she said. "Never, alas, all my life. Granny will tell you that. But John, always the kindest friend and the best brother in the world, did everything he could, and it would have been better for us all if I had taken his advice instead of always, I fear, always my own way." Strangely enough, this cheered Pippo and swept the cloud from his face. "I'm glad you didn't take anybody's advice, Mother. I shouldn't have liked it. I've more faith in you than anybody. Well then, now about this man. What man in the world? I really mean in the world, in what is called society, for that is the kind of people they were, could have such a curiosity about me." She had resumed her seat, and her face was turned away from him. Also the exquisite tone of complacency and innocent self-appreciation with which Philip expressed this wonder helped her a little to surmount the situation. Elinor could have laughed had her heart been only a trifle less burdened. She said, "Are you sure it was at you?" Uncle John said something about ladies behind us, but I am sure it was no ladies behind. It might, of course, the boy added cautiously, have been him, you know. I suppose Uncle John's a personage, isn't he? But after all, you know, hang it, Mother, it isn't easy to believe that a fellow like that would stare so at Uncle John. Poor John. It is true, there is not much novelty about him, said Elinor, with a tremble in her voice, which, if it was half agitation, was yet a little laughter too. For there are scarcely any circumstances, however painful, in which those who are that way, moved by nature, are quite able to quench the unconquerable laugh. She added, with a falter in which there was no laughter, and what was the fellow like? All that I could see was that he was a tall man. I saw his large shirt front and his black evening clothes, and something like gray hair above those two big black goggles. Gray hair, Elinor said, with a low, suppressed cry. He never took them away from his eyes for a moment, so of course I could not see his face, or anything much except that he was more than common tall, like myself, Pippo said, with a little air of pleased vanity in the comparison. Like himself, she did not make any remark. It is very doubtful whether she could have done so. There came before her so many visions of the past, and such a vague, confused, bewildering future, of which she could form no definite idea what it would be. Was it with a pang that she foresaw that drawing towards another influence? That mingled instinct, curiosity, perhaps admiration and wonder, which already seemed to move her boy's unconscious mind? Elinor did not even know whether that would hurt her at all. Even now there seemed a curious pungent sense of half-pleasure in the pain. Like himself, so he was. And if it should be that it was his father, who for hours had stood there, not taking his eyes off the boy, for hours her imagination said, though Pippo had not said so. His father who had known where she was and never disturbed her, never interfered with her. The man who had summoned her to perform her martyrdom for him, never doubting, Phil, with gray hair. To say what mingled feelings swept through Elinor's mind, with all these elements in them, is beyond my power. She saw him with his face concealed, standing up unconscious of the crowded place and of the mimic life on the stage, his eyes fixed upon his son, whom he had never seen before. Where was there any drama in which there was a scene like this? His son, his only child, the heir. Unconsciously, even to herself, that fact had some influence, no doubt, on Elinor's thoughts, and it would be impossible to say how much influence had that unexpected subduing touch of the gray hair, and the strange change in the scene altogether. The foolish, noisy, fast woman, with her turbulent of men and dogs about her, turned into the old lady of Pippo's careless remark, with her daughter beside her far more important than she, and the tall figure in the front of the box with gray hair. Young Philip had not the faintest light or guidance in the discovery of his mother's thoughts. He was much more easy and comfortable now that there had been an explanation between them, though it was one of those explanations which explained nothing. He even forgave Uncle John for knowing more than he did, moved thereto by the consolatory thought that John's advice had never been taken, and that his mother had always followed her own way. This was an incalculable comfort to Pippo's mind, and gave him composure to wait calmly for the clearing up of the mystery, and the restoration of that perfect confidence between his mother and himself, which he was so firmly convinced had existed all his life. He was a great deal happier after, and gave her an excellent account of the play, which he had managed to see quite satisfactorily, notwithstanding the other, little play of our own, which ran through everything. At Philip's age, one can see two things at once well enough. I knew a boy who at one and the same moment got the benefit of, first, his own storybook, which he read lying at full length before the fire, half buried in the fur of a great rug, and second, of the novel which was being read out over his head for the benefit of the other members of the family. Or at least he strenuously asserted he did, and indeed proved himself acquainted with both. Philip in the same way had taken in everything in the play, even while his soul was intent upon the opera glass in the box. He had not missed anything of either. He gave an account of the first, from which the drama might have been written down had fate destroyed it, and had noticed the minauderies of the heroine, and the eager determination not to be second to her in anything which distinguished the first gentleman, as if he had nothing else in his mind. All the time, he had been under the fascination of the two black eye-holes, braquets, upon him, and the mysterious gaze as of a ghost from eyes which he never saw. This occupied some part of the forenoon, and Philip was happy. But when he had completed his tale, and began to feel the necessity of going out, and remembered that he had nowhere to go, and nothing to do, the prospect was not alluring. He tried very hard to persuade his mother to go out with him, but this was a risk from which Elinor shrank. She shrank, too, from his proposal at last to go out to the park by himself. To the Row. I shan't know the people except those who are in Punch every week, and I shall envy the fellows riding, but at least it will be something to see. I wish you would not go to the Row, Pippo. Why, Mother? Doesn't everybody go? And you never were here at this time of the year before. No, she said with a long breath of despair. No, of all times of the year, this was the one in which he had never risked him in London. And oh, that he had been anywhere in the world except London now. Philip, who had been watching her countenance with great interest, here patted her on the shoulder with condescending, almost paternal kindness. Don't you be frightened, Mother. I'll not get into any mischief. I'll neither be rode over, nor robbed, nor run away. I'll take as great care of myself as if you had been there. I'm not afraid that you will be ridden over or robbed, she said, forcing a smile. But there is one thing, Pippo. Don't talk to anybody whom you don't know. Don't let yourself be drawn into. If you should meet, for instance, that lady who was in the theater last night. Yes, Mother. Don't let her make acquaintance with you. Don't speak to her, nor the girl, nor anyone that may be with her, at the risk even of being uncivil. Why, Mother, he said, elevating his eyebrows, how could I be uncivil to a lady? Because I tell you, she cried, because you must, because I shall sit here in terror, counting every moment till you come back, if you don't promise me this. He looked at her with the most wondering countenance, half disapproving, half pitying. Was she going mad? What was happening to her? Was she, after all, though his mother, no better than the jealous, foolish women in books, who endeavored at all costs to separate their children from every influence but their own? How could Pippo think such things of his mother? And yet, what else could he think? I had better, he said, if that is how you feel, Mother, not go to the Row at all. Much better, she cried. I'll tell you what we'll do, Pippo. You have never been to see the Tower. She had run over all the most far-off and unlikely places in her mind, and this occurred to her as the most impossible of all to attract any visitor of whom she could be afraid. I've changed my mind, she added. We'll have a hansom, and I will go with you to see the Tower. So long as you go with me, said Pippo. I don't care where I go. And they set out almost joyfully, as in their old happy expeditions of old, for that long drive through London in the hansom. And yet the boy was only lulled for the moment, and in his heart was more and more perplexed what his mother could mean. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of The Marriage of Elinor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Marriage of Elinor by Margaret O. Oliphant, Chapter 43. Fortune was favorable to Elinor that day. At the tower, where she duly went over everything that was to be seen with Pippo, conscious all the time of his keen observance of her, through all that he was doing, and even through his interest in what he saw, and feeling for the first time in her life that there was between her boy and her something that he felt, something that was not explained by anything she had said, and that awaited the dreadful moment when everything would have to be told. At the tower, as I say, they met some friends from the north, the rector of the parish, who had come up with his son to see town, and was naturally taking his boy, as Elinor took hers, to see all that was not town, in the usual sense of the word. They were going to Woolwich and Greenwich next day, and with a pang of mingled trouble and relief in her mind, Elinor contrived to engage Pippo to accompany them. On the second day, I think they were to go to St. Catherine's Docks, or the Isle of Dogs, or some other equally important and interesting sight. Far better, no doubt, for the two youths than to frequent such places as the Row, and gaze at the stream of gaiety and luxury which they could not join. Pippo, in ordinary circumstances, would have been delighted to see Woolwich and the Docks, but it was so evident to him that his mother was anxiously desirous to dispose of him so, that his satisfaction was much lessened. The boy, however, was magnanimous enough to consent without any appearance of reluctance. In the many thoughts which filled his mind, Philip showed his fine nature by having already come to consent to the possibility that his mother might have business of her own, into which he had no right to enter, unless at her own time and with her full consent. It cost him an effort, I allow, to come to that, but yet he did so, and resolved, a little pride helping him, to inquire no more, and if possible to wonder or be offended no more, but to wait the time she had promised, when the old rule of perfect confidence should be re-established between them. The old rule, if Pippo had but known. Nothing yet had given Elinor such a sense of guilt as his conviction that she had told him everything, that there had been no secrets between them during all the happy life that was past. How entirely relieved Elinor was when he started to join his friends next morning, it would be impossible to put into words. She watched all his lingering movements before he went with eyes in which she tried to quench the impatience, and look only with the fond admiration and interest she felt upon all his little preparations. His dawning sense of what was becoming in apparel, the flower in his coat, the carefully rolled umbrella, the hat brushed to the most exquisite smoothness, the handkerchief just peeping from the breast pocket. It is always a revelation to a woman to find that these details occupy as much of a young man's attention as her own toilette occupies hers, and that he is as tremulously alive to what is worn in many small particulars that never catch her eye, as she is to details which entirely escape him. She smiles at him as he does at her, each in that conscious superiority to the other, which is on the whole an indulgent sentiment. Underneath all her anxiety to see him go, to get rid of him, was that the dreadful truth in this terrible crisis of her affairs. She felt the amusement of the boy's little coquetries, and the mother's admiration of his fresh looks, his youthful brightness, his air of distinction. How different from the rector's boy, who was a nice fellow enough, and a credit to his rectory, and whose mother, I do not doubt, felt in his ruddy good looks something much superior in robustness and strength and manhood to the too tall and too slight golden youth of the ladies at Lakeside. It even flitted across Elinor's mind to give him within herself the title that was to be his. Everybody said, Lord Lomond. And then she asked herself indignantly what honor it could add to her spotless boy to have such a vain distinction, a name that had been soiled by so much ignoble use. Elinor had prided herself all her life on an indifference to, almost a contempt for, the distinctions of rank, and that it should occur to her to think of that title as an embellishment to Pippo. Nay, to think furtively, without her own knowledge, so to speak, that Pippo looked every inch a lord and heir to a peerage, was an involuntary weakness almost incredible. She blushed for herself as she realized it. A peerage which had meant so little that was excellent, a name connected with so many undesirable precedents. Still, I suppose, when it is his own, even the veriest democrat is conscious at least of the picturesqueness, the superiority, as a mode of distinguishing one man from another, of anything can, in the remotest sense, be called a historical name. When Pippo was out of sight, Elinor turned from the window with a sigh, and came back to the dark chamber of her own life, full at this moment of all the gathered blackness of the past and of the future. She put her hands over her eyes and sank down upon a seat, as if to shut out from herself all that was before her. But shut it out as she might, there it was, the horrible court with the judgment seat, the rows of faces bent upon her, the silence through which her own voice must rise alone, saying, what? What was it she was called there to say? Oh, how little they knew who suggested that her mother should have been called instead of her. With all her minute, old-fashioned calculations and exact memory, who even now, when all was over, would probably convict Elinor of a mistake. Even at that penalty, what would not she give to have it over? The thing said, the event done with, whatever it might bring after it. And it could now be only a very short time till the moment of the ordeal would come, when she should stand up in the face of her country, before the solemn judge on his bench, before all the gaping, wondering people, before, oh, the most dreadful of all, which we would not, could not contemplate, before one who knew everything, and say, she picked herself up trembling, as it were, and uncovered her eyes, and protested to herself that she would say nothing that was not true, nothing that was not true. She would tell her story, so well remembered, so often conned, that story that had been put into her lips 20 years ago, which she had repeated then confused, not knowing how it was, that what was a simple fact should nevertheless not be true. Alas, she knew that very well now, and yet would have to repeat it before God and the world. But thinking would make it no better. Thinking could only make it worse. She sprang up again, and began to occupy herself with something she had to do. The less it was thought over, the better, for now the trial had begun, and her ordeal would soon be done too. If only the boy could be occupied, kept away, if only she could be left alone to do what she had to do. That he should be there was the last aggravation of which her fate was capable. There in idleness, reading the papers in the morning, which was a thing she had so lately calculated a boy at school was unlikely to do. And what so likely as that his eye would be caught by his own name in the report of the trial, which would be an exciting trial and fully reported, a trial which interested society. The boy would see his own name. She could almost hear him cry out, looking up from his breakfast. "Hello, Mother. Here's something about a Philip Compton." And all the questions that would follow. Is he the same Compton that we are? What Comptons do we belong to? You never told me anything about my family. Is this man any relation, I wonder? Both surname and Christian name the same. It's strange if there is no connection. She could almost hear the words he would say, all that and more. And what should she reply? I have only one thing to say, Elinor, said John, to whom in her desperation she turned again, as she always did, disturbing him, poor man, in his chambers as he was collecting his notes and his thoughts in the afternoon after his work was over. It is the same as I have always said. Even now make a clean breast of it to the boy. Tell him everything. Better that he should hear it from your own lips than that it should burst upon him as a discovery. He has but to meet Lady Marianne in the park, the most likely thing in the world. No, John, cried Elinor. No, the marshals are here, our rector from Lakeside, and he is taking his boy to see all the sights. I've got Pippo to go out with them. They are going to Woolwich today, and afterwards to quite a long list of things. Oh, entirely out of everybody's way. Her little look of uneasy triumph and satisfaction made John smile. She was not half so sure as she tried to look, but, all the same, had a little pride, a little pleasure in her own management, and in the happy chance of the Marshalls being in London, which was a thing that could not have been planned, an intervention of Providence. He could not refuse to smile, partly with her, partly at her simplicity, but all the same he shook his head. The only way in which there is any safety, the only chance of preserving him from a shock, a painful shock, Elinor, that may upset him for life. How do you mean upset him for life? By showing him that his mother, whom he believes in like heaven, has deceived him since ever he was born. She covered her face with her hands and burst into a sobbing cry. Oh, John, you don't know how true that is. He said to me only yesterday, you have always told me everything, Mother. There has never been any secret between us. Oh, John, John, only think of having that said to me and knowing what I know. Well, Elinor, believe me, my dear, there is but one thing to do. The boy is a good boy, full of love and kindness. Oh, isn't he, John? The best boy, the dearest, and adores his mother as a boy should. John got up from his chair and walked about the room for a little, and then he came behind her and put his hand on her shoulder. Tell him, Elinor, my dear Nellie, as if I had never said a word on the subject before. I beseech you to tell him. Trust him fully, even now, at the 11th hour. She raised her head with a quivering, wistful smile. The moment the trial is over, the moment it is over, I give you my word, John. Do not wait till it is over. Do it now, tonight when he comes home. She began to tremble so that John Tatum was alarmed and kept looking at him with an imploring look, her lips quivering at every line in her countenance. Oh, not tonight. Spare me tonight. After the trial, after my part of it. At least, after, oh, give me till tomorrow to think of it. My dear Elinor, I count for nothing in it. I am not your judge. I am your partisan, you know, whatever you do. But I am sure it will be the better done, and even the easier done, the sooner you do it. I will, at the very latest, the day after I have done my part at the trial. Is not that enough to think of at one time? For a poor woman who has never stood up before the public in all her life, never had a question put to her. Oh, John, oh, John. Elinor, you are too sensible a woman to make a fuss about a simple duty like this. There speaks a man who has stood before the world all his life, and is not afraid of any public, she said, with a tremulous laugh. But she had won her moment's delay, and thus was victorious after a fashion, as it was her habit to be. I do not know that young Philip much amused himself at Woolwich that day. He did, and he did not. He could not help being interested in all he saw, and he liked the Marshalls well enough, and in ordinary circumstances would have entered very heartily into any sightseeing. But he kept thinking all the time what his mother was doing, and wondering over the mysterious business which was to be explained to him sooner or later, and which he had so magnanimously promised to wait for the revelation of, and entertain no suspicions about in the meantime. The worst of such magnanimity is that it is subject to dreadful failings of the heart in its time of waiting, never giving in indeed, but yet feeling the pressure whenever there is a moment to think. This matter mixed itself up so with all Philip saw that he never in afterlife saw a great cannon or a pyramid of balls, which is not, to be sure, an everyday sight, without a vague sensation of trouble, as of something lying behind which was concealed from him, and which he would scarcely endure to have concealed. When he left his friends in the evening, however, it was with another engagement for tomorrow, and several tomorrows after, and great jubilation on the part of both father and son, as to their good luck in meeting, and having his companionship in their pleasures. And, in fact, these pleasures were carried on for several days, always with the faint bitter in them to Philip, of that consciousness that his mother was pleased to be rid of him, glad to see his back turned, the most novel, extraordinary sensation to the boy. And it must also be confessed that he kept a very keen eye on all the passing carriages, always hoping to see that one in which the witch, as he called her, and the girl with the keen eyes were, for he had not picked up the name of Lady Mary Ann, keen as his young ears were, and though John had mentioned it in his presence, partly, perhaps, because it was so very unlikely a name. As for the man with the opera glasses, he had not seen his face at all, and therefore could not hope to recognize him. And yet he felt a little thrill run through him when any tall man with gray hair passed in the street. He almost thought he could have known the tall, slim figure, with a certain swaying movement in it, which was not like anybody else. I need not say, however, that even had these indications been stronger, Woolwich and the Isle of Dogs were unlikely places in which to meet Lady Mary Ann, or any gentleman likely to be in attendance on her. In Whitechapel, indeed, had he but known, he might have met Miss Dolly. But then in Whitechapel there were no sights which virtuous youth is led to see. And Philip's man with the opera glass was, during these days, using that aid to vision in a very different place, and had neither leisure nor inclination to move vaguely about the world. For 3 days this went on successfully enough. Young Philip Compton and Ralph Marshall saw enough to last them all the rest of their lives, and there was no limit to the satisfaction of the good country clergyman, who felt that he never could have succeeded so completely in improving his son's mind, instead of delivering him over to the frivolous amusements of town, if it had not been for the companionship of Philip, who made Ralph feel that it was all right, and that he was not being victimized for nothing. But on the 4th day a hitch occurred. John Tatum had been made to give all sorts of orders and admissions for the party to see every nook and corner of the temple, much to Elinor's alarm, who felt that place was too near to be safe, but she was herself in circumstances too urgent to permit her dwelling upon it. She had left the house on that particular morning long before Philip was ready, and every anxiety was dulled in her mind for the moment by the overwhelming sense of the crisis arrived. She went to his room before he had left, and gave him a kiss, and told him that she might be detained for a long time, that she did not know exactly what hour she should return. She was very pale, paler than he had ever seen her, and her manner had a suppressed agitation in it which startled Philip, but she managed to smile as she assured him she was quite well, and that there was nothing troubling her. Nothing that has to do with us. A little disturbed for a friend, but that will be all over, she said. Tonight, I hope. Philip made a leisurely breakfast after she was gone, and it happened to him that morning for the first time, as he was alone, to make a study of the papers. And the consequence was that he said to himself, really those words which his mother in imagination had so often heard him say. "Hallo, Philip Compton, my name. I wonder if he is any relation. I wonder if we have anything to do with those St. Cerf Comptons." Then he reflected, but vaguely, that he did not know to what Comptons he belonged, nor even what county he came from, to tell the truth. And then it was time to hurry over his breakfast, to swallow his cup of tea, to snatch up hat and gloves, and to rush off to meet his friends. But on that day, Philip was unlucky. When he got to the place of meeting, he found nothing but a telegram from Ralph, announcing that his father was so knocked up with his previous exertions that they were obliged to take a quiet day. And thus Philip was left in the temple, of all places in the world, on the day when his mother was to appear in the law courts close by, on the day of all others when, if she could have sent him for 24 hours to the end of the earth, she would have done so, on the day when so terrible was the stress and strain upon herself that for once in the world even Pippo had gone as completely out of her mind as if he had not been. The boy looked about him for a while and reflected what to do, and then he started out into the Strand, conscientiously waiting for the marshals before he should visit the temple and all its historical ways. And then he was amused and excited by seeing a barrister or two in wig and gown pass by. And then he thought of the trial in the newspapers, in which somebody who, like himself, was called Philip Compton, was involved. Philip was still lingering, wondering if he could get into the court, a little shy of trying, but gradually growing eager, thinking at least that he would try and get a sight of the wonderful grand building, still so new, when he suddenly saw Simmons, his Uncle John's clerk, passing through the quadrangle of the law courts. Here was his chance. He rushed forward and caught the clerk by the arm, who was in a great hurry, as everybody seemed to be. "Oh, Simmons, can you get me into that Brown trial?" cried Philip. "Brown?" Simmons said. "Mr. Tatum is not on in that." "Oh, never mind about Mr. Tatum," said the boy. "Can't you get me in? I have never seen a trial, and I take an interest in that." "I advise you," said Simmons, "to wait for one that your uncle's in." "Can't you get me in?" said Philip impatiently, and this touched the pride of Simmons, who had many friends, if not in high places, yet in low. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of The Marriage of Elinor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Marriage of Elinor by Margaret O. Oliphant. Chapter 44. Philip had never been in a court of law before. I am almost as ignorant as he was. Yet I cannot imagine anything more deeply interesting than to find oneself suddenly one of a crowded assembly trying more or less, for is not the public but a larger jury, sometimes contradicting the verdict of the other, and when it does so, almost invariably winning the cause. A fellow creature, following out the traces of his crime or his innocence, looking on while a human drama is unrolled, often far more interesting than any dramatic representation of life. He was confused for the moment by the crowd, by the new and unusual spectacle, by the bewilderment of seeing for the first time what he had so often heard of, the judge on the bench, the wigged barristers below, the one who was speaking, so different from any other public speaker Philip had ever heard, addressing not the assembly, but the smaller circle round him, interrupted by other voices, the accused in his place and the witness, standing there more distinctly at the bar than the culprit was, bearing his testimony before earth and heaven, with the fate of another hanging on his words. The boy was so full of the novel sight, which yet he had heard of so often, that he could identify every part of it, and soon perceived the scope of what was going on, that he did not at first listen, so full was he of the interest of what he saw. The imperturbable judge, grave, letting no emotion appear on his face. The jury, just the reverse, showing how this and that piece of evidence affected them. The barristers who were engaged, so keenly alive to everything, starting up now and then when the witness swerved from the subject, when the opposition proposed a leading question, or one that was irrelevant to the issue. The others who were not in it, as Simmons said, so indifferent. And then the spectators who had places about or near the central interest. Philip saw, with a sudden leap of his heart, the ladies of the theater and park, the witch and the girl with the keen eyes, in a conspicuous place. The old lady, as he called her, full of movement and gesture, making signs to others near her, keeping up an interrupted whispering, the girl at her side as impassive as the judge himself. And then Pippo's roving eye caught a figure seated among the barristers, with an opera glass, which made his heart jump still more. Was that the man? He had, at the moment Philip perceived him, his opera glass in his hand, a tall man leaning back with a look of interest, very conspicuous among the wigged heads about him, with gray hair and a mass on his forehead as if it had grown thin and had been coaxed to cover some denuded place, and a face which it seemed to Philip he had seen before, a face worn. Was it with study? Was it with trouble? Pippo knew of no other ways in which the eyes could be so hollowed out, and the lines so deeply drawn. A man, perhaps, hard worn with life and labor and sorrow. A strange sympathy sprang up in the boy's mind. He was sure he knew the face. It was a face full of records, though young Philip could not read them. The face, he thought, of a man who had had much to bear. Was it the same man who had fixed so strange a gaze upon himself at the theater? And what interest could this man have in the trial that was going on? The accused at the bar was certainly not of a kind to arouse the interest which sprang into being at sight of this worn and noble hero. He had the air of a comfortable man of business, a man evidently well off, surprised at once and indignant to find himself there, sometimes bursting with eagerness to explain, sometimes leaning back with an air of affected contempt. Not a good man in trouble, as Philip would have liked to think him, nor a criminal fully conscious of what might be awaiting him, but a man of the first respectability, indignant and incredulous that anything should be brought against him. Philip felt himself able to take no interest whatever in Mr. Brown. It was not till he had gone through all these surprises and observations that he began to note what was being said. Philip was not learned in the procedure of the law, nor did he know anything about the case, but it became vaguely apparent to him after a while that the immediate question concerned the destruction of the books of a joint stock company, of which Brown was the manager, an important point which the prosecution had some difficulty in bringing home to him. After it had been proved that the books had been destroyed, and that so far as was known, it was to Brown's interest alone to destroy them, the evidence as to what had been seen on the evening on which this took place suddenly took a new turn and seemed to introduce a new actor on the scene. Someone had been seen to enter the office in the twilight who could not be identified with Brown, whom, indeed, even Philip, with his boyish interest in the novelty of the proceedings, vaguely perceived to be another man. The action of the piece, so to speak, for it was like a play to Philip, changed and wavered here, and he began to be sensible of the character of the different players in it. The counsel for the prosecution was a well-known and eminent barrister, one of the most noted of the time, a man before whom witnesses trembled, and even the bench itself was sometimes known to quail. That this was the case on the present occasion, Philip vaguely perceived. There were points continually arising which the opposing counsel made objections to, appealing to the judge, but it rarely failed that the stronger side, which was that of the prosecution, won the day. The imperious accuser, whose resources of precedent and argument seemed boundless, carried everything with a high hand. The boy, of course, was not aware of the weakness of the representative of the majesty of the law, nor the inferiority, in force and skill, of the defense, but he gradually came to a practical perception of how the matter stood. Philip listened with growing interest, sometimes amused, sometimes indignant, as the remorseless prosecutor plowed his way through the witnesses, whom he bullied into admissions that they were certain of nothing, and that in the dusk of that far-off evening, the man whom they had sworn at the time to be quite unlike him might in reality have been Brown. Philip got greatly interested in this question. He took up the opposite side himself with much heat, feeling as sure as if he had been there that it was not Brown, and he was delighted in his excitement, when there stood up one man who would not be bullied, a man who had the air of a respectable clerk of the lower class, and who held his own. He had been an office boy, the son apparently of the housekeeper in charge of the premises referred to when the incident occurred, and the gist of his evidence was that the prisoner at the bar, so awful a personage once to the little office boy, so curtly discussed now as Brown, had left the office at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 6th of September, and had not appeared again. A different gentleman altogether came in the evening, a much taller man with a large mustache. Where was it that you saw this man? Slipping in at the side door of the office as if he didn't want to be seen. Was that a door which was generally open or used by the public? Never, sir, but none of the doors were used at that time of night. And how, then, could anyone get admittance there? Only those that had private keys. The directors had their private keys. Then your conclusion that it was a director and that he had a right to be there? I knew it was a director, sir, because I knew the gentleman, the witness said. You say it was late in the evening of the 6th of September. Was it daylight at the time? Oh, no, sir. Nearly dark. A sort of a half-light. Did the person you saw go in openly or make any attempt at concealment? He had a light coat on, like the coats gentlemen wear when they go to the theater, and something muffled round his throat, and his hat pulled down over his face. Like a person who wished to conceal himself? Yes, sir, said the witness. And how, then, if he was muffled about the throat and his hat pulled over his face, in the half-light late in the evening, could you see that he had a large mustache? The witness stood and stared with his mouth open and made no reply. The counsel, with a louder voice and those intonations of contemptuous insinuation which are calculated to make a man feel that he is convicted of the basest perjury and is being held up to the reprobation of the world, repeated the question. How could you see that he had a large mustache? I saw it, said the witness hotly, because I knew the gentleman. And how did you know the gentleman? You thought you recognized the gentleman, and therefore, though you could not possibly perceive it, you saw his mustache? I fear that is not an answer that will satisfy the jury. I submit, said the counsel for the defense, that it is very evident what the witness means. He recognized a man with whose appearance he was perfectly familiar. I saw him, said the witness, as clear as I see you, sir. What, in the dark, late on a September night, with a coat collar up to his ears and a hat pulled down over his face? You see my learned friend in broad daylight, and with the full advantage of standing opposite to him and studying his looks at your leisure. You might as well say, because you know the gentleman, that you could see his half was dark and abundant under his wig. At this, a laugh ran through the court, at which Philip, listening, was furiously indignant, as it interrupted the course of the investigation. It was through the sound of this laugh that he heard the witness demand loudly, "How could I be mistaken when I saw Mr. Compton every day?" Mr. Compton? Philip's heart began to beat like the hammers of a steam engine. Was this, then, the real issue? And who was Mr. Compton? He could not have told how it was that he somehow identified the man whom the witness had seen or had not seen with the man who had the opera glass and who had fixed a dreadful blank stare upon the other in the witness box during a great part of this discussion. Was it he who was on trial and not Brown? And who was he? And where was it that Philip had known and grown familiar with that face, which, so far as he could remember, he had never seen before, but which belonged to the man who bore his own name? When the counsel for the prosecution had turned the unfortunate witness outside in and proved that he knew nothing and had seen nobody, and that, besides, he was a man totally unworthy of credit, who had lied from his cradle, and whose own mother and friends put no trust in him, the court adjourned for lunch. But Philip forgot that he required any lunch. His mind was filled with echoes of that name. He began to feel a strange certainty that it was the same man who had fixed him with the same gaze in the theater. Who was Mr. Compton, and what was he? The question took the boy's breath away. He sat through the interval, finding a place where he could see better, through the kind offices of the usher to whom Simmons had commended him, and waiting with impatience till the trial should be resumed. Nobody remarked the boy among the crowd of the ordinary public, many of whom remained, as he did, to see it out. Philip cared nothing about Brown. All that he wanted to know was about this namesake of his, this Compton, this other man, who was not Brown. If it was the man with the opera glass, he was not so much excited as his young namesake, for he went to luncheon with the rest, while the boy remained counting the minutes, eager to begin the story, the drama again. The impression left, however, on Philip's impartial mind was that the last witness, though driven and badgered out of what wits he had by the examination, had really seen a man whom he perfectly knew, his recognition of whom was not really affected either by the twilight or the disguise. The thrill of interest which he felt running through all his veins as the court filled again was like, but stronger than, the interest with which he had ever seen the curtain rise in the theater. His heart beat. He felt as if, in some sort, it was his own fate that was going to be decided. All his prepossessions were in favor of the other accused, yet not openly accused, person who was not Brown. And yet he felt almost as sure as if he had been there that the office boy of 20 years ago had seen that man stealing in at the side door. Young Philip did not catch the name of the next witness who was called. Such a thing will happen sometimes, even with the quickest ear, at a moment when every whisper is important. If he had heard, he would probably have thought that he was deceived by his excitement. Impossible, as it was, that such a name should have anything to do with this or any other trial. The shock, therefore, was unbroken when, watching with all the absorbed interest of a spectator at the most exciting play, the boy saw a lady come slowly forward into the witness box. Philip had the same strange sense of knowing who it was that he had felt the previous witness to have in respect to the man whom he could not see, but yet had infallibly recognized. But he said to himself, no, it was not possible. No, it was not possible. She came forward slowly, put up the veil that had covered her face, and grasped the bar before her to support herself. And then the boy sprang to his feet, in the terrible shock which electrified him from head to feet. His movements and the stifled cry he uttered made a little commotion in the crowd and called forth the cry of "Silence in the court." His neighbors around him hustled him back into his place, where he sank down incapable indeed of movement, knowing that he could not go and pluck her from that place, could not rush to her side, could do nothing but sit there and gasp and gaze at his mother, in such a place, in such a case, with which, surely, she could have nothing to do. Elinor Compton, at the time referred to Elinor Denniston of Windy Hill in Surrey. There was no doubt about the name now, and Philip had time enough to identify everything, name and person, but there rose a vague surging of contention about the first questions put to her, which were not evidence, according to the counsel on the other side, which he felt with fury was done on purpose to prolong the agony. During this time she stood immovable, holding on by the rail before her eyes fixed upon it, perfectly pale, like marble, and as still. Among all the moving, rustling, palpitating crowd, and the sharp volleys of the lawyers' voices, and even the contradictory opinions elicited from the harassed judge himself, to look at that figure standing there, which scarcely seemed to breathe, had the most extraordinary effect. For a time Philip was like her, scarcely breathing, holding on in an unconscious sympathy to the back of the seat before him, his eyes wide open, fixed upon her. But as his nerves began to accustom themselves to that extraordinary, inconceivable sight, the other particulars of the scene came out of the mist and grew apparent to him in a lurid light that did not seem the light of day. He saw the eager looks at her of the ladies in the privileged places, the whispers that were exchanged among them. He saw underneath the witness box, almost within reach of her, John Tatum, with an anxious look on his face. And then he saw, what was the most extraordinary of all, the man who had been the center of his interest till now, the man whose name was Philip Compton, like his own, he who fixed the last witness with the stare of his opera glass, who had kept it in perpetual use. He had put it down now on the table before him. His arms were folded on his breast, and his head bent. Philip thought he detected now and then a furtive look under his brows at the motionless witness, awaiting through the storm of words the moment when her turn would come. But though he had leaned forward all the time, following every point of the proceedings with interest, he now drew back, effaced himself, retired as it were from the scene. What was there between these two? Was there any link between them? What was the drama about to be played out before Pippo's innocent and ignorant eyes? At last the storm and wrangling seemed to come to an end, and there came out low but clear the sound of her voice. It seemed only now, when he heard his mother speak, that he was certified that so inconceivable a thing as that she could be here was a matter of fact. His mother here. Philip fixed his whole being upon her. Eyes, thoughts, absorbed attention. He scarcely seemed to breathe except through her. Could she see him, he wondered, through all that crowd? But then he perceived that she saw nothing with those eyes, that looked steadily in front of her, not turning a glance either to the right or left. For some time, Philip was baffled by the questions put, which were those to which the counsel on the other side objected as not evidence, and which seemed, even to the boy's inexperienced mind, to be mere play upon the subject, attempts to connect her in some way with the question as to Brown's guilt or innocence. Something in the appearance at this stage of a lady so unlike the other witnesses seemed to exercise a certain strange effect, however, quickening everybody's interest. And when the examining counsel approached the question of the date which had already been shown to be so momentous, all interruptions were silenced, and the court in general, like Philip, held its breath. There were many there expecting what are called in the newspapers revelations. The defense was taken by surprise and did not know what new piece of evidence was about to be produced. And even the examining counsel was, for such a man, subdued a little by the other complicating threads of the web among which he had to pick his way. "You recollect," he said in his most soothing tones, "the evening of the 6th September, 1863? She bowed her head in reply, and then, as if that was sparing herself too much, added a low "yes." "As I am instructed, you were not then married, but engaged to Mr. Philip Compton, is that so?" "Yes." "One of the directors of the company of which the defendant was manager?" "I believe so." "I am sorry to have to enter upon matters so private, but there was some question, I believe, about an investment to be made of a portion of your fortune in the hands of this company?" "Yes." "You received a visit from Mr. Compton on the subject on the day I have mentioned?" The witness made a slight movement and pause, then answered as before, but more firmly. "Yes," she added, "not on this subject," in a lower tone. "You can recollect more or less exactly the time of his arrival?" "Yes, it was in the evening after dinner, in the darkening before the lamps were lit." "Were you looking for him on that night?" "No, it was an unexpected visit. He was going to Ireland, and paused on his way through town to come down to Windy Hill." "You have particular reasons for remembering the date, which make it impossible that there could be any mistake?" "No, there could be no mistake." "You will perhaps inform the court, Mrs. Compton, why your memory is so exact on this point?" Once more she hesitated for a moment and then replied, "It was exactly 10 days before my marriage." "I think that will do, Mrs. Compton. I will trouble you no further," the counsel said. The hubbub which sprang up upon this seemed to Philip for the moment as if it were directed against his mother, which, of course, was not the case, but intended to express the indignant surprise of the defense at the elaborate examination of a witness who had nothing to say on the main subject. The leader on the other side, however, though taken by surprise, and denouncing the trick which his learned brother had played upon the court by producing evidence which had really nothing to do with the matter, announced his intention to put a further question or two to Mrs. Compton. Young Philip in the crowd started again from his seat, with the feeling that he would like to fly at that man's throat. 20 years is a long time," he said, "and it is difficult to be sure of any circumstance at such a distance. Perhaps the witness will kindly inform us what were the circumstances which fixed this, no doubt one of many visits, on her mind." Elinor turned for the first time to the side from which the question came, with a little movement of that impatience which was habitual to her, which 3 persons in that crowd recognized in a moment as characteristic. One of these was John Tatum, who had brought her to the court, and kept near, that she might feel that she was not alone. The other was her son, of whose presence there nobody knew. The third sat with his eyes cast down, and his arms folded on his breast, not looking at her, yet seeing every movement she made. "It was a very simple circumstance," she said with the added spirit of that impetuous impulse. But then the hasty movement failed her, and she came back to herself and to a consciousness of the scene in which she stood. A sort of tremulous shiver came into her voice. She paused and then resumed. "There was a calendar hanging in the hall. It caught Mr. Compton's eye, and he pointed it out to me. It marked the 6th. He said, 'Just 10 days.'" Here her voice stopped altogether. She could say no more, and there was an answering pause throughout the whole crowded court, a holding of the general breath. The response to a note of passion seldom struck in such a place. Even in the cross-examination there was a pause. "Till when? What was the other date referred to?" "The 16th of September," she said in a voice that was scarcely audible to the crowd. she added still more low so that the judge curved his hand over his ear to hear her. "Our wedding day." "I regret to enter into private matters, Mrs. Compton, but I believe it is not a secret that your married life came to a more rapid conclusion than could have been augured from such a beginning. May I ask what your reasons were for?" But here the other counsel sprang to his feet, and the contention rose again. Such a question was not clearly permissible, and the prosecution was perfectly satisfied with the evidence. It narrowed the question by the production of this clear and unquestionable testimony, the gentleman who it had been attempted to involve being thus placed out of the question, and all the statements of the previous witness about the mustache, which he could not see, etc., set aside. Philip, it may be supposed, paid little attention to this further discussion. His eyes and thoughts were fixed upon his mother, who for a minute or two stood motionless through it, as pale as ever, but with her head a little thrown back, facing, though not looking at, the circling lines of faces. Had she seen anything, she must have seen the tall boy standing up, as pale as she, following her movements with an unconscious repetition which was more than sympathy, never taking his gaze from her face. And then presently her place was empty, and she was gone. Philip was not aware how the discussion of the lawyers ended, but only that in a moment there was vacancy where his mother had been standing, and his gaze seemed thrown back to him by the blank where she had been. He was left in the midst of the crowd, which, after that one keen sensation, fell back upon the real trial with interest much less keen. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of The Marriage of Elinor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Marriage of Elinor by Margaret O. Oliphant, Chapter 45. Philip did not know how long he remained, almost paralyzed in the court, dazed in his mind, incapable of movement. He was in the center of a long row of people, and to make his way out was difficult. He felt that the noise would call attention to him, and that he might be somehow identified. Identified as what? He did not know. His head was not clear enough to give any reason. When he came more to himself, and his eyes regained a little their power of vision, it seemed to him that everybody had stolen away. There was the judge, indeed, still sitting imperturbable, the jury restless in their box, the lawyers going on with their eternal quarrel over a bewildered witness, all puppets carrying on some unintelligible, wearisome automaton process, contending forever about nothing. But all that had secured Philip's attention was gone. John Tatum's head was no longer visible under the witness box. The ladies had disappeared from their elevated seats. The man with the opera glass was gone. They were all gone, and the empty husks of a question which only concerned the comfort and life of the commonplace culprit in the dock were being turned over and over like chaff by the wind. And yet it was some time before poor young Pippo, shy of attracting attention, feeling some subtle change even in himself, which he did not understand, afraid to have people look at him and divine him, knowing more of him perhaps than he himself knew, could make up his mind to move. He might have remained there till the court broke up, but for the movement of someone beside him, who gathered up his hat and umbrella and with some commotion pushed his way between the rows of seats. Philip followed, thankful of the opportunity, and, as it happened, the sensation of the day being over, many others followed too, and thus he got out into the curious, wondering daylight, which seemed to look him in the face, as if this Philip, had never been seen by it before. That was the impression given him, that when he first came out, the atmosphere quivered round him with a strange novelty, as if he were some other being, someone without a name, new to the world, new to himself. He did not seem sure that he would know his way home, and yet he did not call a passing hansom, as he would have done yesterday, with a schoolboy's pleasure in assuming a man's careless, easy ways. It is a long way from the law courts to Ebury Street, but it seemed a kind of satisfaction to be in motion, to walk on along the crowded streets. And, as a matter of fact, Philip did lose his way, and got himself entangled in a web of narrow streets and monotonous little openings, all so like each other that it took him a long time to extricate himself and find again the thread of a locality known to him. He did not know what he was to do when he got in. Should he find her there, in the little dingy drawing-room as usual, with the tea on the table? Would she receive him with her usual smile, and ask where he had been and what he had seen, and if the Musgraves had enjoyed it, exactly as if nothing had happened? Even this wonder was faint in Philip's mind, for the chief wonder to him was himself, and to find out how he had changed since the morning, what he was now, who he was. What were the relations to him of other people, of that other Philip Compton, who had been seated in the court with the opera glass, who had arrived at Windy Hill to visit Elinor Denniston on the 6th of September, 1863. 20 years ago? Who was that man? And what was he, himself Philip Compton, of Lakeside, named Pippo, whom his mother had never once in all his life called by his real name? To his great wonder, and yet almost relief, Philip found that his mother had not returned when he got to Ebury Street. Mrs. Compton said, as she would very likely be late, "Can I get you some tea, sir? Or perhaps you haven't had your lunch? You're looking tired and worried," said the landlady, who had known Pippo all his life. He consented to have tea, partly to fill up the time, and went up languidly to the deserted room, which looked so miserable and desert a place without her, who put a soul into it and made it home. He did not know what to do with himself, poor boy, but sat down vacantly and stared into empty space, seeing wherever he turned the rows of faces, the ladies making signs to each other, the red robes of the judge, the lawyers contending, and that motionless pale figure in the witness box. He shut his eyes and saw the whole scene, then opened them again and still saw it. The dingy walls disappearing, the grayness of the afternoon giving a depth and distance to the limited space. Should he always carry it about with him wherever he went? The vision of that court, the shock of that revelation? And yet he did not know what the revelation was. The confusion in his mind was too great, and the dust and mist that rose up about him as all the old building of his life crumbled and fell away. "I'm sure as it's that nasty trial, sir, as has been turning your mamma all out of her usual ways," said the landlady, appearing with her tray. "Oh, the trial. Did you know about the trial?" said Philip. "Not, Mr. Pippo, as ever she mentioned it to me. Mrs. Compton is a lady as isn't that confidential, though always an affable lady, and not a bit proud. But when you've known folks for years and years, and taken interest, and put this and that together. Dear, I hope as you don't think it's taking a liberty. It's more kindness nor curiosity, and I hope as you won't mention it to your mamma." Pippo shook his head and waved his hand, at once to satisfy the woman and dismiss her if possible. But this was not so easy to do. "And Lord, Saint Serve so bad, sir," she said. "Lord, do you think that before we know where we are, there may be such changes and new names, and no knowing what to say?" But it's best not to talk of it till it comes to pass, for there's many a slip between the cup and the lip, and there's no saying what will happen with a man that's been a-dying for years and years. What did the woman mean? He got rid of her at length, chiefly by dint of making no reply, and then, to tell the truth, Pippo's eyes had been caught by the pile of sandwiches which the kind woman, pitying his tired looks, had brought up with the tea. He was ashamed of himself for being hungry in such a dreadful emergency as this, but he was so, and could not help it, though nothing would have made him confess so much, or even touch the sandwiches till she had gone away. He pretended to ignore them till the door was shut after her, but could not help vividly remembering that he had eaten nothing since the morning. The sandwiches did him a little good in his mind, as well as in his body. He got rid of the vision of the faces and of the red figure on the bench. He began to believe that when he saw her, she would tell him. Had she not said so? That after a while he should hear everything, and that all should be as it was before? All as it was before, in the time when she told him everything, even things that Granny did not know. But she had never told him this, and the other day she had told him that it was other people's secrets, not her own, that she was keeping from him. Other people's secrets, the secrets of the man who was Philip Compton, who went to Windy Hill on the 6th of September, 10 days before Elinor Deniston's marriage day. What Philip Compton? Who was he? What had he to do with her? What, oh what, Pippo said to himself, has he to do with me? After all, that was the most tremendous question. The others, or anything that had happened 20 years ago, were nothing to that. Meanwhile, Elinor, of all places in the world, was in John Tatum's chambers, to which he had taken her to rest. I cannot tell how Mr. Tatum, a man so much occupied, managed to subtract from all he had to do almost a whole day to see his cousin through the trial, and stand by her, sparing her all the lesser annoyances which surround and exaggerate such a great fact. He had brought her out into the fresh air, feeling the movement was the best thing for her, and instead of taking her home in the carriage which was waiting, had made her walk with him, supported on his arm, on which he hung in a sort of suspended life, across the street to the temple, hoping thus to bring her back, by the necessity of exertion, to herself. And indeed she was almost more restored to herself by this remedy than John Tatum had expected or hoped. For though he placed her in the great easy-chair, in which her slender person was engulfed and supported, expecting her to rest there and lie motionless, perhaps even to faint, as women are supposed to do when it is particularly inconvenient and uncomfortable. Elinor had not been there 2 minutes before she rose up again and began to walk about the room, with an aspect so unlike that of an exhausted and perhaps fainting woman, that even John, used as he was to her capricious ways, was confounded. Instead of being subdued and thankful that it was over, and this dreadful crisis in her life accomplished, Elinor walked up and down, wringing her hands, moaning and murmuring to herself. What was it she was saying? God forgive me, God forgive me, over and over and over, unconscious apparently that she was not alone, that anyone heard or observed her. No doubt there is in all our actions the very best, much for God to forgive. Mingled motives, imperfect deeds, thoughts full of alloy and selfishness. But in what her conscience could accuse her now, he could not understand. She might be to blame in respect to her husband, though he was very loath to allow the possibility. But in this act of her life, which had been so great a strain upon her, it was surely without any selfishness, for his interest only, not for her own. And yet John had never seen such a fervor of penitence, so strong a consciousness of evil done. He went up to her, and laid his hand upon her arm. "Elinor, you are worn out. You have done too much. Will you try and rest a little here, or shall I take you home?" She started violently when he touched her. "What was I saying?" she said. "It does not matter what you were saying. Sit down and rest. You will wear yourself out. Don't think any more. Take this and rest a little, and then I will take you home." "It is easy to say so," she said with a faint smile. "Don't think. Is it possible to stop thinking at one's pleasure?" "Yes," said John, "quite possible. We must all do it or we should die. And now your trial's over, Nellie. For goodness sakes, exert yourself and throw it off. You have done your duty." "My duty? Do you think that was my duty?" "Oh, John, there are so many ways to look at it." "Only one way, when you have a man's safety in your hands." "Only one way, when one has a man's safety, his honor. Do you think a woman is justified in whatever she does to save that?" "I don't understand you, Elinor. In anything you have done or could do, certainly you are justified. My dear Nellie, sit down and take this, and then I will take you home." She took the wine from his hand and swallowed a little of it, and then looking up into his face with the faint smile which she put on when she expected to be blamed, and intended to deprecate and disarm him, as she had done so often. "I don't know," she said, "that I am so anxious to get home, John. You were to take Pippo to dine with you, and to the house tonight." "So I was," he said. "We did not know what day you would be called. It is a great nuisance, but if you think the boy would be disappointed not to go—" "He would be much, much disappointed. First chance he has had of hearing a debate. He would be much better at home, taking care of you." "As if I wanted taking care of, or as if the boy, who has always been the object of everybody's care himself, would be the proper person to do it. If he had been a girl, perhaps, but it is a little late at this time of day to wish for that now." "You were to tell him everything tonight, Elinor." "Oh, I was to tell him. Do you think I have not had enough for one day? Enough to wear me out, body and soul? You have just been telling me so, John." He shook his head. "You know," he said, "and I know, that in any case you will have it your own way, Elinor. But you have promised to tell him." "John, you are unkind. You take advantage of me being here, and so broken down, to say that I will have my own way. Has there been my own way at all? I would have fled if I could, and taken the boy far, far away from it all. But you would not let me. Yes, I have promised, but I am tired to death. How could I look him in the face and tell him?" She hid her face suddenly in her hands with a moan. "It will be in the papers tomorrow, Elinor." "Well, I will tell him tomorrow morning," she said. John shook his head again, but it was done behind her, where she could not see the movement. He had more pity of her than words could say. When she covered her face with her hands in that most pathetic of attitudes, there was nothing that he would not have forgiven her. What was to become of her now? Her position through all these years had never been so dangerous, in John's opinion, never so sad as now. Philip Compton had been there looking on while she put his accusers to silence. At what cost to herself John only began dimly to guess, to divine, to forbid himself to inquire. That fellow had been there all the time. He had the grace not to look at her, not to distract her with the sight of him. Probably for his own sake, John thought bitterly, that she might not risk breaking down. But he was there, and knew where she was to be found, and he had seen the boy, and had cared enough to fix his gaze upon him, that gaze which John had found intolerable at the theater, and he was on the eve of becoming Lord St. Cerf, and Pippo his heir. What was to be the issue of these complications? What was to happen to her, who had hid the boy so long, who certainly could hide him no more? He took her home to Ebury Street shortly after, where Philip, weary of waiting, and having made a meal he much wanted off the sandwiches, had gone out again in his restlessness and unhappiness. Elinor, who had become paler and paler as the carriage approached Ebury Street, and who by the time she reached the house looked really as if at last she must swoon, her heart choking her, her breathing quick and feverish, had taken hold of John to support her, clutching at his arm, when she was told that Philip was out. She came to herself instantly on the strength of that news. "Tell him when he comes in to make haste," she said, "for Mr. Tatum is waiting for him. As for me, I am fit for nothing but bed. I have had a very tiring day." "You do look tired, ma'am," said the sympathetic landlady. "I'll run up and put your room ready, and then I'll make you a nice cup of tea." John Tatum thought that, notwithstanding her exhaustion, her anxiety, all the realities of troubles present and to come that were in her mind and in her way, there was a flash something like triumph in Elinor's eyes. "Tell Pippo," she said, "he can come up and say good night to me before he goes. I am good for nothing but my bed. If I can sleep, I shall be able for all that is before me tomorrow." The triumph was quenched, however, if there had been triumph, when she gave him her hand, with a wistful smile, and a sigh that filled that tomorrow with the terror and the trouble that must be in it. Did she do what she said? John went up to the little drawing room to wait for Pippo, with a heavy heart. It seemed to him that never had Elinor been in so much danger. She had exposed herself to the chance of losing the allegiance of her son. She was at the mercy of her husband, that husband whom she had renounced, yet whom she had not refused to save, whose calls she had obeyed to help him, though she had thrown off all the bonds of love and duty towards him. She had not had the strength either way to be consistent, to carry out one steady policy. It was cruel of John to say this, for but for him and his remonstrances Elinor would, or might have fled, and avoided this last ordeal. But he had not done so, and now here she was in the middle of her life, her frail ship of safety, driven about among the rocks, dependent upon the magnanimity of the husband from whom she had fled, and the child whom she had deceived. "Your mother is very tired, Philip," he said, when the boy appeared. "I was to tell you to go up and bid her good night before you went out, for it will probably be late before you get back, if you think you are game to sit out the debate." "I will sit it out," said Philip, with no laughter in his eye, with an almost solemn air, as if announcing a grave resolution. He went upstairs, not 3 steps at a time, as was his wont, but soberly, as if his years had been 40 instead of 18. And he showed no surprise to find the room darkened, though Elinor was a woman who loved the light. He gave his mother a kiss and smoothed her pillow with a tender touch of pity. "Is your head very bad?" he said. "It is only that I am dreadfully tired, Pippo. I hope I shall sleep, and it will help me to think you are happy with Uncle John." "Then I shall try to be happy with Uncle John," he said, with a sort of smile. "Good night, Mother. I hope you'll be better tomorrow." "Oh, yes," she said. "Tomorrow is always a new day." He seemed in the half-light to nod his head, and then to shake it, as one that assents, but doubts, having many troubled thoughts and questions in his mind. But Pippo did not at all expect to be happy with Uncle John. End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of The Marriage of Elinor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Marriage of Elinor by Margaret O. Oliphant, Chapter 46. It cannot be said that Uncle John was very happy with Philip, but that was a thing the others did not take into account. John Tatum was doing for the boy as much as a man could do. A great debate was expected that evening, in which many eminent persons were to speak, and Mr. Tatum gave Philip a hasty dinner in the house so that he should lose nothing, and he found him a corner in the Distinguished Strangers Gallery, telling him with a smile that he expected him hereafter to prove his title to such a place. But Philip's smile in return was very unlike the flush of pleasure that would have lighted it up only yesterday. John felt that the boy was not at all the delightful young companion, full of interest in everything, that he had been. Perhaps he was on his good behavior, on his dignity, bent upon showing how much of a man he was and how little influenced by passing sentiments, as some boys do. Anyhow, it was certain that he was much less agreeable in his self-subdued condition. But John was fortunately much interested in the discussion, in which, indeed, he took himself a slight part, and save for a passing wonder and the disappointment of the moment, did not occupy himself very much with Pippo. When he looked into the corner, however, in a lull of the debate, when one of those fools who rush in at unguarded moments when the speaker chances to look their way, had managed to get upon his foolish feet to the despair of all around. The experienced man of the world received a curious shock from the sight of young Philip's intense gravity and the self-absorbed, unconscious look he wore. The boy had the look of hearing nothing, seeing nothing that was around him, of being lost in thoughts of his own, thoughts far too serious and troubled for his age. Had he discovered something? What did he know? This was the instinctive question that rose in John's mind, and not in amused anticipation of Pippo's original boyish view of the question and the speakers, such as had delighted him on the boy's previous visits to the house. And indeed, Philip's attention was little fixed upon the debate. He tried hard to bring it back, to keep it there, to get the question into his mind. But in spite of himself, his thoughts flew back to the other public assembly in which he had sat unnoticed that day, till gradually the aspect of things changed to him. The speaker became the judge, the Whig secretaries the pleaders, and he almost expected to see that sudden apparition, that sight that had plucked him out of his careless life of boyhood and trust, the sight of his mother standing before the world on trial for her life. Oh, no, not on trial at all. He was aware of that. A harmless witness, doing only good. The judge could have nothing but polite regard for her. The jury admiration and thanks for the clear testimony, which took a weight from their shoulders. But before her son, she was on her trial for more than life. And he who said with so much assurance that his mother had no secrets from him, until the moment arrived, without any warning, in the midst of his security, which proved that everything had been secret, and that all was mystery, all mystery, and nothing sure in life. It crossed Philip's mind more than once to question John Tatum upon this dreadful discovery of his. John, who was a relation, who had been the universal referee of the household as long as he could remember. Uncle John must know. But there were two things which held him back. First, the recollection of his own disdainful offense at the suggestion that Uncle John, an outsider, could know more than he did of the family concerns, and partly from the proud determination to ask no questions, to seek no information that was not freely given to him. He made up his mind to this while he looked out from his corner upon the lighted house, seeing men move up and down, and voices going on, and the sound of restless members coming and going, while the business of the country went on. It was far more important than any private affairs that could be passing in an individual brain. And Philip knew, with what high-handed certainty, he would have put down the idea that to himself at his age there could be anything private half so exciting, half so full of interest, as a debate on the policy of the country which might carry with it the highest issues. But conviction comes readily on such subjects when the personal interest comes which carries every other away. It was while a minister was speaking, and everything hanging on his words, that the boy made up his mind finally that he would ask no questions. He would ignore that scene in the law courts, as if it had not been. He would say nothing, try to look as if nothing had passed, and wait to see if any explanation would come. It was not, perhaps, then to be wondered at if John found him a much less interesting companion than ever before, as they walked home together in the small hours of the night. Mr. Tatum's own speech had been short, but he had the agreeable consciousness that it had been an effective one, and he was prepared to find the boy excited by it, and full of applause and satisfaction. But Philip did not say a word about the speech. He was only a boy, and it may be supposed that any applause from him would have had little importance for the famous lawyer, the highly esteemed member who kept his independence, and whose speeches always secured the attention of the House, and carried weight as among the few utterances which concerned the real import of the question, and not its mere party meaning. But John was hurt more than he could have thought possible by Philip's silence. He even tried to lead the conversation artfully to that point in the debate, thinking perhaps the boy would shy of speaking on the subject, but with no effect. It was exceedingly strange. Had he been deceived in Philip? Had the boy really no interest in subjects of an elevated description? Or was he ill? Or what was the matter with him? It troubled John to let him go on alone from Halkin Street to his lodging, with a vague sense that something might happen. But that was, of course, too absurd. "Tell your mother I'll come round in the afternoon tomorrow, as soon as I am free," he said, holding Philip's hand. And then he added paternally, still holding that hand, "Go to bed at once, boy. You've had a tiring day." "Yes, I suppose so," said Philip, drawing his hand away. "I hope you haven't done too much," said John, still lingering. "You're too young for politics, and to sit up so late. I was wrong to keep you out of bed." "I hope I'm not such a child as that," said Philip, with a half-smile, and then he went away. And John Tatum, with an anxious heart, closed behind him his own door. If it were not for Elinor and her boy, what a life free of anxiety John would have had. Never any need to think with solicitude of anything outside that peaceful door. No trouble with other people's feelings, with investigations what this or that look or word meant. But perhaps it was Elinor and her boy, after all. None of his, thinking of him as an outsider, having nothing to do with their most intimate circle of confidence and natural defense, who, by means of that very anxiety, kept alive the higher principles of humanity in John Tatum's heart. Philip went home, walking quickly through the silent streets. They were very silent at that advanced hour, yet not so completely but that there was a woman who came up to the boy at the corner. Philip neither knew nor desired to know what she said. He thought nothing about her one way or another. He took a shilling out of his pocket and threw it to her as he passed, walking on with the quick elastic step which the sudden acquaintance he had made with care had not been able to subdue. He saw that there was still a faint light in his mother's window when he reached the house, but he would not disturb her. How little would he have thought of disturbing her on any other occasion? "Are you asleep, mother?" he would have said, looking in, and the time had never been when Elinor was asleep. She had always heard him, always replied, always been delighted to hear the account of what he had been doing, and how he had enjoyed himself. But not tonight. With a heart full of longing, yet of sick revolt against the sight of her, he went past her door to his room. He did not want to see her, and yet, oh, if she had only called to him, if she had but said a word. Elinor, for her part, was not asleep. She had slept a little while she was sure that Philip was safely disposed of, and herself secured from all interruption. But when the time came for his return, she slept no longer, and had been lying for a long time holding her breath, listening to every sound, when she heard his key in the latch and his foot on the stair. Would he come in as he always did? Or would he remember her complaint of being tired, a complaint she so seldom made? It was as a blow to Elinor when she heard his step go on past her door, and yet she was glad. Had he come in, there was a desperate thought in her mind that she would call him to her bedside, and in the dark, with his hand in hers, tell him all that there was to tell. But it was again a relief when he passed on, and she felt that she was spared for an hour or two, spared for the new day, which perhaps would give her courage. It was an endless night, long hours of dark, and then longer hours of morning light, too early for anything, while still nobody in the house was stirring. She had scarcely slept at all during that long age of weary and terrible thought, for it was not as if she had but one thing to think of. When her mind turned, like her restless body, from one side to another, it was only to a change of pain. What was it she had said, standing up before earth and heaven and calling God to witness that what she said was true? It had been true, and yet she knew that it was not, and that she had saved her husband's honor at the cost of her own. Oh, not in those serious and awful watches of the night can such a defense be accepted as that the letter of her testimony was true. She did not attempt to defend herself. She only tried to turn to another thought that might be less bitter, and then she was confronted by the confession that she must make to her boy. She must tell him that she had deceived him all his life, hid from him what he ought to have known, separated him from his father and his family, kept him in ignorance, despite all that had been said to her, despite every argument. And when Elinor in her misery fled from that thought, what was there else to think of? There was her husband, Pippo's father, from whom he could no longer be kept. If she had thought herself justified in stealing her child away, out of fear of the influence that father might have had upon him, how would it be now when they must be restored to each other, at an age much more dangerous for the boy than in childhood, and with all the attractions of mystery and novelty, and the sense that his father had been wronged? When she escaped from that, the most terrible thought of all, feeling her brain whirl and her heart burn as she imagined her child turning from the mother who had deceived him to the father who had been deprived of him, her mind went off to that father himself, from whom she had fled, whom she had judged and condemned, but who had repaid her by no persecution, no interference, no pursuit, but an acceptance of her verdict, never molesting her, leaving her safe in the possession of her boy. Perhaps there were other ways in which Phil Compton's magnanimity have been looked at, in which it would have shown in less favorable colors. But Elinor was not ready to take that view. Her tower of justice and truth and honor had crumbled over her head. She was standing among her ruins, feeling that nothing was left to her, nothing upon which she could build herself a structure of self-defense. All was wrong, a series of mistakes and failures, to say no worse. She had driven on ever willful, all through, escaping from every pang she could avoid, throwing off every yoke that she did not choose to bear, until now, here she stood to face all that she had fled from, unable to elude them more, meeting them as so many ghosts in her way. Oh, how true it was what John had said to her so long ago, that she was not one who would bear, who, if she were disappointed and wronged, could endure and surmount her trouble by patience. Oh, no, no. She had been one who had put up with nothing, who had taken her own way, and now she was surrounded on every side by the difficulties she had thrust away from her, but which now could be thrust away no more. It may be imagined what the night was which Elinor spent sleepless, struggling one after another with these thoughts, finding no comfort anywhere wherever she turned. She had not been without many a struggle even in the most quiet of the years that had passed, in one long dream of peace as it seemed now, but never as now had she been met wherever she turned by another and another lion in the way. She got up very early, with a feeling that movement had something lulling and soothing in it, and that to lie there a prey to all these thoughts was like lying on the rack, to the great surprise of the kind landlady, who came stealing into her room with the inevitable cup of tea, and whose inquiry how the poor lady was taken out of her mouth by the unexpected apparition of the supposed invalid, fully dressed, moving about the room, with all the air of having been up for hours. Elinor asked with a sudden precaution that the newspapers might be brought up to her, not so much for her own satisfaction, for it made her heart sick to think of reading over in dreadful print, as would be done that morning, at millions of breakfast tables, her own words, perhaps with comments on herself and her history, which might fall into Pippo's hands, and be read by him before he knew, which was a sudden spur to herself, and evidence of the dread necessity of letting him know that story from her own lips, which had not occurred to her before. She glanced over the report with a sickening sense that all the privacy of sheltered life and honorable silence was torn off from her, and that she was exposed as on a pillory to the stare and the remarks of the world, and crushed the paper away like a noxious thing into a drawer where the boy at least would never find it. Vain thought, as if there was but one paper in the world, as if he could not find it at every street corner, thrust in his hand even as he walked along. But at all events for the moment he would not see it, and she would have time to tell him before that revelation could come in his way. She went downstairs, with what a tremor in her and sinking of her heart it would be impossible to say. To have to condemn herself to her only child, to humble herself before him, her boy, who thought there was no one like his mother, to let him know that he had been deceived all his life, he who thought she had always told him everything. Oh, poor mother! Oh, poor boy! She was still sitting by the breakfast table waiting in a chill fever, if such a thing can be, for Philip, when a thing occurred which no one could have thought of, and yet which was the most natural thing in the world, which came upon Elinor like a thunderbolt, shattering all her plans again just at the moment when, after so much shrinking and delay, she had at last made up her mind to the one thing that must be done at once. The sound of the driving up of a cab to the door made her go to the window to look out, without producing any expectation in her mind. But people were coming and going in Ebury Street all day long. She saw, however, a box which she recognized upon the cab, and then the door was opened, and Mrs. Denniston stepped out. Her mother. The wonder was not that she came now, but that she had not come sooner. No letters for several days. Her child and her child's child in town, and trouble in the air. Mrs. Denniston had borne it as long as she could, but there had come a moment when she could bear it no longer, and she too had followed Pippo's example and taken the night mail. Elinor stood motionless at the window and saw her mother arrive, and did not feel capable of going to meet her, or of telling whether it was some dreadful aggravation of evil, or an interposition of Providence to save her for another hour at least from the ordeal before her. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of The Marriage of Elinor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Marriage of Elinor by Margaret O. Oliphant, Chapter 47. Mrs. Denniston had a great deal to say about herself and the motives which had, at the last, been too much for her, which had forced her to come after her children at a moment's notice, feeling that she could bear the uncertainty about them no longer. And it was a thing so unusual with her to have much to say about herself that there was certainly something apologetic, something self-defensive in this unaccustomed outburst. Perhaps she had begun to feel a little the unconscious criticism that gathers round the elder person in a house, the inclination involuntarily, which everyone would repudiate, yet which nevertheless is true, to attribute to her a want of perception perhaps, not unkindly, a little blunting of the faculties, a suggestion quite unintentional that she is not what she once was. She explained herself so distinctly that there was no doubt there was some self-defense in it. I had not had a letter for 3 days. And Ellen was far more humble than her wont. I know, Mother, I felt as if it were impossible to write, till it was over. My darling, I thought at last I must come and stand by you. I felt that I ought to have seen that all the time, that you should have had your mother by your side to give you countenance. I had John with me, Mother. Then it is over, Mrs. Denniston cried. And at that moment Pippo, very late, pale, and with eyes which were red with sleeplessness and perhaps with tears, came in. Elinor gave her mother a quick look, almost of blame, and then turned to the boy. She did not mean it, and yet Mrs. Denniston felt as if the suggestion, he might never have known had you not called out like that, was in her daughter's eyes. Pippo, she said, why, Elinor, what have you been doing to the boy? He does not look well, said Elinor, suddenly waking up to that anxiety which had always been so easily roused in respect to Pippo. He was very late last night. He was at the house with John, she added, involuntarily, with an apology to her mother for the neglect which had extended to Pippo, too. There is nothing the matter with me, he said, with a touch of sullenness in his tone. The two women looked at each other with all the vague trouble in their eyes suddenly concentrated upon young Philip. But they said nothing more, as he sat down at table and began to play with the breakfast, for which he had evidently no appetite. No one had ever seen that sullen look in Pippo's face before. He bent his head over the table as if he were intent upon the food which choked him when he tried to eat, and which he loathed the very sight of, and did not say a word. They had certainly not been very light-hearted before, but the sight of the boy thus obscured and changed made all the misery more evident. There was always a possibility of overriding the storm so long as all was well with Pippo, but his changed countenance veiled the very sun in the skies. You don't seem surprised to see me here, his grandmother said. Oh, no, I am not surprised. I wonder you did not come sooner. Have you been traveling all night, he said. Just as you did, Pippo. I drove into Penrith last night and caught the mail train. I was seized with a panic about you, and felt that I must see for myself. It is not the first time you have taken a panic about us, Mother, said Elinor, forcing a smile. No, but it is almost the first time I have acted upon it, said Mrs. Denniston, with that faint instinct of self-defense. But I think you must have needed me more than usual to keep you in order. You must have been going out too much, keeping late hours. You were pale enough, Elinor, but Pippo has suffered still more. I tell you, said Philip, raising his shoulders and stooping his head over the table, Granny, that there is nothing the matter with me." And he took no part in the conversation as they went on talking of any subjects but those that were most near their hearts. They had, indeed, no thoughts at all to spare, but those that were occupied with the situation, and with this new feature in it, Pippo's worn and troubled looks, yet had to talk of something, of nothing, while the meal went on, which was no meal at all for any of them. When it was over at last, Pippo rose abruptly from the table. "Are you going out?" Elinor said, alarmed, rising too. "Have you any engagement with the Marshalls for today?" "I don't know," Philip said. "Mr. Marshall was ill yesterday. I didn't see them. I'm not going out. I am going to my room." "You've got a headache, Pippo." "Nothing of the kind. I tell you, there is nothing the matter with me. I'm only going to my room." Elinor put her hands on his arm. "Pippo, I have something to say to you before you go out. Will you promise to let me know before you go out? I don't want to keep you back from anything, but I have something that I must say." He did not ask with his usual interest what it was. He showed no curiosity. On the contrary, he drew his arm out of her hold almost rudely. "Of course," he said, "I will come in here before I go out. I have no intention of going out now." And thus he left them, and went with a heavy step. Oh, how different from Pippo's flying foot, so that you could count every step upstairs. "What is the matter? What is the matter, Elinor?" "I know nothing," she said, "nothing. He was like himself yesterday morning, full of life. Unless he is ill, I cannot understand it. But, Mother, I have to tell him everything today." "God grant it may not be too late, Elinor," Mrs. Denniston said. "Too late? How can it be too late? Yes, perhaps you are right, John and you. He ought to have known from the beginning. He ought to have been told when he was a child. I acknowledge that I was wrong, but it is no use," she said, wiping away some fiery tears, "to go back upon that now." "John could not have told him anything," Mrs. Denniston said doubtfully. "John, my best friend, who has always stood by me. Oh, never, never. How little you know him, Mother. He has been imploring me every day, almost upon his knees, to tell Pippo everything, and I promised to do it as soon as the time was come. And then last night I was so glad to think that he was engaged with John, and I so worn out, not fit for anything. And then this morning I arrived, just when I would have been better away." "Don't say that, Mother. It is always, always well you should be with your children. And oh, if I had but taken your advice years and years ago." How easy it is to wish this when fate overtakes us, when the thing so long postponed, so long pushed away from us, has to be done at last. There is, I fear, no repentance in it, only the intolerable sense that the painful act might have been over long ago, and the soul free now of a burden which is so terrible to bear. Philip did not leave his room all the morning. His mother, overwhelmed now by the new anxiety about his health, which had no part in her thoughts before, went to his door and knocked several times, always with the intention of going in, of insisting upon the removal of all barriers, and of telling her story, the story which now was as fire in her veins and had to be told. But he had locked his door, and only answered from within that he was reading, getting up something that he had forgotten, and I begged her to leave him undisturbed till lunch. Poor Elinor! Her story was, as I have said, like fire in her veins. But when the moment came, and a little more delay, an hour, a morning was possible, she accepted it like a boon from heaven, though she knew very well all the same that it was but prolonging the agony, and that to get it accomplished, to get it over, was the only thing to desire. She tried to arrange her thoughts, to think how she was to tell it, in the hurrying, yet flying minutes when she sat alone, listening now and then to Philip's movements over her head. For he was not still as a boy should be, who was reading, but moved about his room, with a nervous restlessness that seemed almost equal to her own. Mrs. Denniston, to leave her daughter free for the conversation that ought to take place between Elinor and her son, had gone to lie down, and lay in Elinor's room, next door to the boy, listening to every sound and hoping that they would get it over before she went downstairs again. She did not believe that Philip would stand out against his mother, whom he loved. Oh, if they could but get it over, that explanation, if the boy but knew. But it was apparent enough when she came down to luncheon, where Elinor awaited her, pale and anxious, and where Philip followed, so unlike himself, that no explanation had yet taken place between them. And the luncheon was as miserable a pretense at a meal as the breakfast had been. Worse as a repetition, yet better insofar that poor Pippo, with his boyish wholesome appetite, was by this time too hungry to be restrained, even by the unusual burden of his unhappiness, and ate heartily, although he was bitterly ashamed of so doing, which perhaps made him feel a little better, and certainly did a great deal of good to the ladies, who thus were convinced that whatever the matter might be, he was not ill at least. He was about to return upstairs after luncheon was over, but Elinor caught him by the arm. "You are not going to your room again, Pippo?" "I have not finished my reading," he said. "I have a claim before your reading. I have a great deal to say to you, and I cannot put it off any longer. It must be said." "As you please, mother," he replied, with an air of endurance, and he opened the door for her and followed her up to the drawing-room, the three generations going one before the other, the anxious grandmother first, full of sympathy for both, the mother trembling in every limb, feeling the great crisis of her life before her, the boy with his heart seared, half bitter, half contemptuous of the explanation which he had forestalled, which came too late. Mrs. Denniston turned and kissed first one and then the other with quivering lips. "Oh, Pippo, be kind to your mother. She never will have such need of your kindness again in all your life." The boy could almost have struck her for this advice. It raised a kind of savage passion in him to be told to be kind to his mother. Kind to her, when he had held her above all things on the earth, and prided himself all his life upon his devotion to her. What Mrs. Denniston said to Elinor I cannot tell, but she clasped her hands and gave her an imploring look, which was almost as bitterly taken as her appeal to Philip. It besought her to tell everything, to hide nothing, and what was Elinor's meaning but to tell everything, to lay bare her heart? But once more at this moment an interruption, the most wonderful and unthought of all interruptions, came. I supposed it must have been announced by the usual summons at the street door, and that in their agitation they had not heard it. But all I know is that when Mrs. Denniston turned to leave the mother and son to their conversation, which was so full of fate, the door of the drawing-room opened almost upon her, as she was about to go out, and with a little demonstration and pride, as of a name which it was a distinction even to be permitted to say, of a visitor whose arrival could not be but an honor and delightful surprise. The husband of the landlady, the man of the house, once a butler of the highest pretensions, now only condescending to serve his lodgers when the occasion was dignified, swept into the room, noiseless and solemn, holding open the door, and announced, "Lord St. Cerf." Mrs. Denniston fell back as if she had met a ghost, and Elinor, too, drew back a step, becoming as pale as if she had been the ghost her mother saw. The gap of the long breath they both drew made a sound in the room where the very air seemed to tingle, and young Philip, raising his head, saw, coming in, the man whom he had seen in court, the man who had gazed at him in the theater, the man of the opera glass. But was this then not the Philip Compton for whom Elinor Denniston had stood forth and bore witness before all the world? He came in and stood without a word, waiting for a moment till the servant was gone and the door closed, and then he advanced with a step, the very assurance and quickness of which showed his hesitation and uncertainty. He did not hold out his hands, much less his arms, to her. "Nell," he said, as if he had been asking a question. "Nell?" She seemed to open her lips to speak, but brought forth no sound, and then Mrs. Denniston came in with the great voice of every day. "Will you sit down?" He looked round at her, perceiving her for the first time. "Ah," he said, "Mamma, how good that you are here. It is a little droll, though, don't you think, when a man comes into the bosom of his family after an absence of 18 years, that the only thing that is said to him should be, 'Will you sit down?' Better that, however, a great deal than, 'Will you go away?'" He sat down as she invited him, with a short laugh. He was perfectly composed in manner, looking round him with curious eyes. "Was this one of the places," he said, "Nell, that we stayed in the old days?" She answered "No" under her breath, her paleness suddenly giving way to a hot flush of feverish agitation. And then she took refuge in a vacant chair, unable to support herself, and he sat too, and the party looked, but for that agitation in Elinor's face, which she could not master, as if the ladies were receiving and he paying a morning call. The other two, however, did not sit down. Young Philip, confused and excited, went away to the second room, the little back drawing-room of the little London house, which can never be made to look like anything but an anteroom, never a habitable place, and went to the window, and stood there as if he were looking out, though the window was of colored glass, and there was nothing to be seen. Mrs. Denniston stood with her hand upon the back of a chair, her heart beating too, and yet the most collected of them all, waiting, with her eyes on Elinor, for a sign to know her will, whether she should go or stay. It was the visitor who was the first to speak. "Let me beg you," he said, with a little impatience in his voice, "to sit down too. It is evident that Nell's reception of me is not likely to be so warm as to make it unpleasant for a third party. There was a fourth party in the room a minute ago, if my eyes did not deceive me." Ah, his glance went rapidly to where Philip's tall, boyish figure, with his back turned, was visible against the further window. "That's all right," he said. "Now, I presume everybody's here." "Had we expected your visit," said Mrs. Denniston, faltering after a moment, as Elinor did not speak, "we should have been better prepared to receive you, Mr. Compton." "That's not spoken with your usual cleverness," he said with a laugh. "You used to be a great deal too clever for me. You and Nell, too. But if she did not expect to see me, I don't know what she thought I was made of. Everything that is bad, I suppose. And yet you know I could have worried your life out of you if I had liked Nell." She turned to him for the first time, and putting her hands together said almost inaudibly, I know, I have thought of that, and I am not ungrateful." "Grateful? Well, perhaps you have not much call for that, poor little woman. I don't doubt I behaved like a brute, and you were quite right in doing what you did. But you've taken it out of me since now, all the same." Then there was again a silence, broken only by the laboring, which she could not conceal, of her breath. "You wouldn't believe me," he resumed after a moment, "if I were to set up a sentimental pose, like a sort of disconsolate widower, would you?" Of course it would be a position that was not without its advantages. I was not much made for a family man, and both in the way of expense and in other ways, it suited me well enough. Nobody could expect me to marry them or their daughters, don't you see, when they knew I had a wife alive. So I was allowed my little amusements. You never went in for that kind of thing, Nell. Don't snap me up. You know I told you I never was against a little flirtation. It makes a woman more tolerant, in my opinion, just to know how to amuse herself a little. But Nell was never one of that kind. I hope not, indeed, said Mrs. Denniston, to whom he had turned with indignation. I don't see where the emphasis comes in. She was one that a man could be as sure of as of Westminster Abbey. The heart of her husband rests upon her. Isn't that what the fellow in the Bible says, or words to that effect? Nell was always a kind of Bible to me, and you may say that in that case, to think of her amusing herself. But you will allow, she always did take everything too much au grand sérieux. No, to be sure, you'll allow nothing. But still, that was the truth. However, I'll allow something if you won't. I'm past my first youth. Oh, you not a bit of it. You're just as fresh and as pretty, by George, as ever you were. When I saw you stand up in that court yesterday looking as if not a week had passed since I saw you last, by Jove. Nell, and how you were hating it, poor old girl, and come out straining your poor little conscience and saying what you didn't want to say, for the sake of a worthless fellow like me. A sob came out of Elinor's breast, and something half inaudible besides, like a name. I can tell you this, he said, turning to Mrs. Denniston again. I couldn't look at her. I'm an unlikely brute for that sort of thing, but if I had looked at her, I should have cried. I dare say you don't believe me. Never mind, but it's true. I do believe you, said the mother, very low. Thank you, he said with a laugh. I have always said for a mother-in-law, you were the least difficult to get on with I ever saw. Do you remember giving me that money to make ducks and drakes of? It was awfully silly of you. You didn't deserve to be trusted with money to throw it away like that. But still, I have not forgotten it. Well, I came to thank you for yesterday, Nell, and there are things, you know, that we must talk over. You never gave up your name. That was like your pluck. But you will have to change it now. It was indecent of me to have myself announced like that, and poor old St. Cerf not in his grave yet. But I dare say you didn't pay any attention. You are Lady St. Cerf now, my dear. You don't mind, I know, but it's a change not without importance. Well, who is that fellow behind there, standing in the window? I think you ought to present him to me, or I'll present him to you instead. I saw him in the theater, by Jove, with that fellow Tatum, that cousin John of yours that I never could bear, smirking and smiling at him as if it were his son. But I saw the boy then for the first time. Nell, I tell you there are some things in which you have taken it well out of me. Mr. Compton, she said, laboring to speak. Lord St. Cerf. Oh, Phil. Ah, he said with a start. Do you remember at last? The garden at that poky old cottage with all the flowers, and the days when you looked out for wild Phil Compton, that all the world warned you against. And here I am, an old fogey, without either wife or child, and Tatum taking my boy about and Nell never looking me in the face. Philip at the window looking out at nothing through the hideous colored glass had heard every word, with wonder, with horror, with consternation, with dreadful disappointment and sinking of the heart. For indeed he had a high ideal of a father, the highest, such as fatherless boys form in their ignorance. And every word made it more sure that this was his father, This man who had so caught his eyes and filled him with such a fever of interest. But to hear Phil Compton talk had brought the boy's soaring imagination down to the dust. He had not been prepared for anything like this. Some tragic rending asunder he could have believed in, some wild and strange mystery. But this man of careless speech, of chaff and slang, so little noble, so little serious, so far from tragic. The disappointment had been too sudden and dreadful to leave him with any ears for those tones that went to his mother's heart. He had no pity or sense of the pathos that was in them. He stood in his young absolutism, disgusted, miserable. This man, his father. This man, so talking, so thinking. Young Philip stood with his back to the group, more miserable than words could say. He heard some movement behind him, but he was too sick of heart to think what it was, until suddenly he felt a hand on his shoulder, and most unwillingly suffered himself to be turned round to meet his father's eyes. He gave one glance up at the face, which he did not now feel was worn with study and care, which now that he saw it near, was full of lines and wrinkles which meant something else, and which even the emotion in it, emotion of a kind which Pippo did not understand, hidden by a laugh, did not make more prepossessing, and then he stood with his eyes cast down, not caring to see it again. The elder Philip Compton had, I think, though he was, as he said, an unlikely subject for that mood, tears in his eyes, and he had no inclination to see anything that was painful in the face of his son, whose look he had never read, whose voice he had never heard till now. He held the boy with his hands on his shoulders, with a grasp more full perhaps of the tender strain of love, though he did not know him, than ever he had laid upon any human form before. The boy's looks were not only satisfactory to him, but filled his own heart with an unaccustomed spring of pride and delight. His stature, his complexion, his features, making up, as it were, the most wonderful compliment, the utmost sweetness of flattery that he had ever known. For the boy was himself over again, not like his mother, like the unworthy father whom he had never seen. It took him some time to master the sudden rush of this emotion, which almost overwhelmed him, and then he drew the boy's arm through his own and led him back to where the two ladies sat. Elinor still too much agitated for speech. "I said I'd present my son to you, Nell, if you wouldn't present him to me," he said, with a break in his voice which sounded like a chuckle to that son's angry ears. "I don't know what you call the fellow, but he's big enough to have a name of his own, and he's Lomond from this day." Pippo did not know what was meant by those words, but he drew his arm from his father's and went and stood behind Elinor's chair, forgetting in a moment all grievances against her, taking her side with an energy impossible to put into words, clinging to his mother as he had done when he was a little child. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of The Marriage of Elinor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Marriage of Elinor by Margaret O. Oliphant, Chapter 48. It was while this conversation was going on that John Tatum, anxious and troubled about many things, knocked at the door in Ebury Street. He was anxious to know how the explanations had got accomplished, how the boy took it, how Elinor had borne the strain upon her of such a revelation. Well, as he knew Elinor, he still thought, as is generally thought in circumstances so painful, that a great crisis, a great mental effort, would make her ill. He wanted to know how she was. He wanted to know how Pippo had borne it, what the boy thought. It had glanced across him, that young Philip might be excited by so wonderful a new thing, and form some false impression of his father, whom doubtless she would represent under the best light, taking blame upon herself not to destroy the boy's ideal, and be eager to know him, which was a thing, John felt, which would be very difficult to bear. The door was opened to him, not by good Mrs. Jones, the kindly landlady, but by the magnificent Jones himself, who rarely appeared. John said, "Mrs. Compton," as a matter of course, and was about to pass in his usual familiar way. But something in the man's air made him pause. He looked at Jones again, who was bursting with importance. "Perhaps she's engaged," he said. "I think, sir," said John, "that her ladyship is engaged. His lordship is with her ladyship upstairs." "His what?" John Tatum cried. "His lordship, Mr. Tatum. I know, sir, as the title is not usually assumed till after the funeral. But in the very house where her ladyship is residing for the moment, there's allowances to be made. Naturally, we're a little excited over it, being, if I may make so bold as to say, a sort of humble friends, and long patronized by her ladyship, and young Lord Lomond, too." "Young Lord Lomond, too?" John Tatum stood for a moment and stared at Mr. Jones, and then he laughed out and turned his back and walked away. Young Lord Lomond, too, the boy, who had been more like John's boy than anything else, but now tricked out in a new name, a new position, his father's heir. Oh yes, it was John himself who had insisted on that only a few days ago. The heir to a peerage can't be hid. It was he that had quoted this as an aphorism worthy of a social sage. But when the moment came and the boy was taken from him and introduced him into that other sphere, by the side of that man who had once been the dishonorable Phil, good heavens, what changes life is capable of! What wrongs, what cruelties, what cuttings off, what twists and alterations of every sane thought and thing. John Tatum was a sensible man, as well as an eminent lawyer, and knew that between Elinor's son, who was Phil Compton's son, and himself, there was no external link at all. Nothing but affection and habit, and the ever-strengthening link that had been twisted closer and closer with the progress of these years. But nothing real, the merest shadow of relationship, a cousin who could count how often removed. And it was he who had insisted, forced upon Elinor, the necessity of making his father known to Philip, of informing him of his real position. Nobody had interfered in this respect but John. He had made himself a weariness to her by insisting, never giving over, blaming her hourly for her delay. And yet now, when the thing he had worked so hard for, so constantly urged, was done, he smiled grimly to himself as he walked away. They were all together, the lordship and the ladyship, young Lord Lomond too, and Phil Compton, whitewashed, a peer of the realm, and still the scoundrel. A handsome fellow enough, with an air about him, a man who might still dazzle a youngster unaccustomed to the world. He had re-entered the bosom of his family, and doubtless was weeping upon Philip's neck, and bandying about that name of Nell, which had always seemed to John an insult to himself. And in that moment of bitterness, John did not know how she would take it, what effect it would produce upon her. Perhaps the very sight of the fellow who had once won her heart, the lover of her youth, with whom John had never for a moment put himself into competition, notwithstanding the bitter wonder in his heart that Elinor of all people, could ever have loved such a man. Yet she had loved him, and the sight of him again after so many years, what effect might it not produce? As he walked away, it was the idea of a happy family that came into John Tatum's mind. mutual forgiveness, mutual return to the old traditions, which are the most endearing of all. Expansions, confessions, recollections, and lives of reunion. Something more than a prodigal's return. The return of a sinner bringing a coronet in his hand, bringing distinction, a place and position enough to dazzle any boy, enough to make a woman forgive. And was not this what John wished above all things? Every advancement for the boy, and an assured place in the world, as well as every happiness that might be possible. Happiness. Yet it was possible she might think it so. For Elinor? Yes, this was what he had wished for, been ready to make any sacrifice to secure. In the sudden shock, Mr. Tatum thought of the only other person who perhaps, yet only perhaps, might feel a little as he did. The mother, Mrs. Denniston, upon whom he thought all this would come like a thunderclap, not knowing that she was upstairs in the family party, among the lordships and the ladyship too. He went home and into his handsome library, and shut the door upon himself, to have it out there, or rather to occupy himself in some more sensible way, and shut this foolish subject out of his mind. It occurred to him, however, when he sat down, that the best thing to do would be to write an account of it all to Mrs. Denniston, who doubtless in the excitement would have a long time to wait for news of this great change. He drew his blotting book towards him with this object and opened it, and dipped his pen in the ink and wrote, "My dear aunt." But he did not get much farther. He raised his head, thinking how to introduce his narrative, for which she would in all likelihood be wholly unprepared, and in so doing looked round upon his bookcases, on one shelf of which the reflection of a ray of afternoon sunshine caught in the old Louis XIII mirror over the mantelpiece was throwing a shaft of light. He got up to make sure that it was only a reflection, nothing that would harm the binding of a particular volume upon which he had set great store. Though, of course, he knew very well that it could only be a reflection, no impertinent reality of sunshine being permitted to penetrate there. And then he paused a little to draw his hand lovingly over the line of choice books, very choice, worth a little fortune, which he laughed at himself a little for being proud of, fully knowing that what was inside them, which generally is the cream of a book, as of a letter, according to Tony Lumpkin, was in many cases worth nothing at all. And then John went and stood upon the hearth-rug, and looked round him upon this, the heart of his domain. It was a noble library. Any man might have been proud of it. He asked himself whether it did not suit him better, with all the comforts and luxuries beyond it, than if he had ever been like other men, with an entirely different center of life upstairs in the empty drawing-room, and the burden upon him of setting out children, boys and girls, upon the world. When a man asks himself this question, however complacent may be the reply, it betrays perhaps a doubt whether the assurance he has is so very sure after all. And he returned to his letter to Mrs. Denniston, which would be quite easy to write if it were only once well begun. But he had not written above a few words, having spent some time in his previous reflections, when he paused again at the sound of a tumultuous summons at the street door. As may be well supposed, his servant took more time than usual to answer it, resenting a noise so out of character with the house, during which John listened half angrily, fearing, yet wishing for, a diversion. And then his own door burst open, not, I need not say, by any intervention of legitimate hands, but by the sudden rush of Philip, who seemed to come in a whirl of long limbs and eager eyes, flinging himself into a chair, and fixing his gaze across the corner of the table upon his astonished yet expectant friend. "Oh, Uncle John," the boy cried, and had not breath to say any more. John put forth his hand across the table and grasped the young, flexible, warm hand that wanted something to hold. "Well, my boy," he said. "I suppose you know," said Philip. "I have nothing to tell you, though it is all so strange to me." "I know. Nothing about what interests me most at present. Yourself, Pippo, and what has happened to you." John had always made a great stand against that particular name, but several times had used it of late, not knowing why. "I don't know what you thought of me last night," said the boy. "I was so miserable. May I tell you everything, Uncle John?" What bomb that question was! He clasped Pippo's hand in his own, but scarcely could answer to bid him go on. "It was unnecessary, all she wanted to tell me. I fought it off all the morning. I was there yesterday in the court and heard it all." "In the court? At the trial?" "I had no meaning in it," said Philip. "I went by chance, as people say, because the marshals had not turned up. I got Simmons to get me into the court. I had always wanted to see a trial. And there I saw my mother stand up. My mother, that I never could bear the wind to blow on, standing up there alone with all these people staring at her to be tried for her life." "Don't be a fool, Philip," said John Tatum, dropping his hand. "Tried? She was only a witness, and she was not alone. I was there to take care of her." "I saw you, but what was that? She was alone all the same, and for me, it was she who was on trial. What did I know about any other? I heard it every word." "Poor boy." "So what was the use of making herself miserable to tell me? She tried to all this morning, and I fought it off. I was miserable enough. Why should I be made more miserable to hear her perhaps excusing herself to me? But at last she had driven me into a corner, angry as I was. Uncle John, I was angry, furious with my mother. Fancy, with my mother." John did not say anything, but he nodded his head in assent. How well he understood it all. "And just then, at that moment, he came. I am angry with her no more. I know whatever happened, she was right. Angry with her, my poor dear, dearest mother. Whatever happened, she was right. It was best that she should not tell me. I am on her side all through. All through. Do you hear me, Uncle John? I have seen you look as if you blamed her. Don't again while I am there. Whatever she has done, it has been the right thing all through." "Pippo," said John, with a little quivering about the mouth, "give me your hand again, old fellow. You're my own boy." "Nobody shall so much as look as if they blamed her," cried the boy, "while I am alive." Oh, how near he was to crying, and how resolute not to break down, though something got into his throat and almost choked him, and his eyes were so full that it was a miracle they did not brim over. Excitement, distress, pain, the first touch of human misery he had ever known, almost overmastered Philip. He got up and walked about the room, and talked and talked. He who had never concealed anything, who had never had anything to conceal. And for 24 hours he had been silent with a great secret upon his soul. John was too wise to check the outpouring. He listened to everything, assented, soothed, imperceptibly led him to gentler thoughts. "And what does he mean," cried the boy at last, "with his new name? I shall have no name but my own, the one my mother gave me. I am Philip Compton, and nothing else. What right has he, the first time he ever saw me, to put upon me another name?" "What name?" "He called me Lomond, or something like that," said young Philip, and then there came a sort of stillness over his excitement, a lull in the storm. Some vague idea what it meant came all at once into the boy's mind, and a thrill of curiosity, of another kind of excitement, of rising thoughts which he did not hardly understand, struggled up through the other zone of passion. He was half ashamed, having just poured forth all his feelings to show that there was something else, something that was no longer indignation, nor anger, nor the shock of discovery, something that had a tremor perhaps of pleasure in it, behind. But John was far too experienced a man not to read the boy through and through. He liked him better in the first phase, but this was natural too. "It happens very strangely," he said, "that all these things should come upon you at once. But it is well you should know now all about it. Lomond is the second title of the Comptons, Earls of St. Cerf. Haven't I heard you ask what Comptons you belong to, Philip? It has all happened within a day or two. Your father was only Philip Compton yesterday at the trial, and a poor man. Now he is Lord St. Cerf, if not rich, at least no longer poor. Everything has changed for you, your position, your importance in the world. The last Lord Lomond bore the name creditably enough. I hope you will make it shine." He took the boy by the hand and grasped it heartily again. "I am thankful for it," said John. "I would rather you were Lord Lomond than—" "What, Uncle John?" "Steady, boy. I was going to say Philip Compton's son, but Lord St. Cerf is another man." There was a long pause in the room where John Tatum's life was centered among his books. He had so much to do with all this business, and yet so little. It would pass away with all its tumults, and he, after being absorbed by it for a moment, would be left alone to his own thoughts and his own unbroken line of existence. So much the better. It is not good for any man to be swept up and put down again at the will of others in matters in which he has no share. As for Philip, he was silent chiefly to realize this great thing that had come upon him. He, Lord Lomond, a peer's son, who was only Pippo of Lakeside, like any other lad in the parish, and not half so important at school as Musgrave, who did not get that scholarship. What the school would say, the tempest that would arise. They would ask a holiday, and the headmaster would grant it. Compton a lord. Philip could hear the roar and rustle among the boys, the scornful incredulity, the asseverations of those who knew it was true, and a flush that was pleasure had come over his musing face. It would have been strange if in the wonder of it there had not been some pleasure too. He had begun to tolerate his father before many days were over, to cease to be indignant and angry that he was not the ideal father of his dreams. That was not Lord St. Cerf's fault, who was not at all aware of his son's dreams, and had never had an ideal in his life. But John Tatum was right in saying that Lord St. Cerf was another man. The shock of a new responsibility, of a position to occupy and duties to fulfill, were things that might not have much moved the dishonorable Phil 2 years before. But he was 50, and beginning to feel himself an old fogey, as he confessed, and his son overawed Lord St. Cerf. His son, who was so like him, yet had the mother's quick, impetuous eyes, so rapid to see through everything, so disdainful of folly, so keen in perception. He was afraid to bring upon himself one of those lightning flashes from the eyes of his boy, and doubly afraid to introduce his son anywhere, to show him anything that might bring upon him the reproach of doing harm to Pippo. His house, which had been very decent and orderly in the late Lord St. Cerf's time, became almost prim in the terror Phil had, lest they should say that it was bad for the boy. As for Lady St. Cerf, it was popularly reported that the reason why she almost invariably lived in the country was her health, which kept her out of society. A report, I need not say, absolutely rejected by society itself, which knew all the circumstances better than you or I do, but which sufficed for the outsiders who knew nothing. When Elinor did appear upon great occasions, which she consented to do, her matured beauty gave the fullest contradiction to the pretext on which she continued to live her own life. But old Lord St. Cerf, who got old so long before he need to have done, with perhaps the same sort of constitutional weakness which he carried off all his brothers before their time, or perhaps because he had too much abused a constitution which was not weak, grew more and more fond in his latter days of the country too, and kept appearing at Lakeside so often that at last the ladies removed much nearer town, to the country house of the St. Serphs, which had not been occupied for ages, where they presented at last the appearance of a united family, and where Lomond, who would have thought it very strange now to be addressed by any other name, brought his friends, and was not ill-pleased to hear his father discourse, in a way which sometimes still offended the home-bred Pippo, but which the other young men found very amusing. It was not in the way of morals, however, that Lord St. Serph ever offended. The fear of Elinor kept him as blameless as any good-natured preacher of the endless theme, that all is vanity, could do. These family arrangements, however, and the modified happiness obtained by their means, were still all in the future, when John Tatum, a little afraid of the encounter, yet anxious to have it over, went to Ebury Street the day after these occurrences, to see Elinor for the first time under her new character as Lady St. Serph. He found her in a languor and exhaustion much unlike Elinor, doing nothing, not even a book near, lying back in her chair, fallen upon herself, as the French say. Some of those words that mean nothing passed between them, and then she said, "John, did Pippo tell you that he had been there?" He nodded his head, finding nothing to say. Without any warning, to see his mother stand up before all the world to be tried for her life. "Elinor," said John, "you are as fantastic as the boy." I was being tried for my life before him as the judge, and he has acquitted me. But, oh, I wonder if he would have done so had he known all that I know. "I do so," said John, perhaps a little more used to the laws of evidence than Pippo. "Ah, you," she said, giving him her hand, with a look which John did not know how to take, whether as the fullest expression of trust or an affectionate disdain of the man, in whose partial judgment no justice was. And then she asked a question which threw perhaps the greatest perplexity he had ever known into John Tatum's life. "When you tell a fact, that is true, with the intention to deceive, John, you know the laws of evidence. Is that a lie?" End of The Marriage of Elinor by Margaret O. Oliphant.